I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be allowed and authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit in the subcommittee today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document in the record, please also email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. First, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Aviation industry has experienced extraordinary volatility over the last few years. To put things in perspective, air passenger revenue miles dropped 96% from January 2020 until April of 2020. The FAA, recognizing the incredible changes in the aviation sector, actually cut by half their goals for controller hiring in 2021. But just as quickly as the pandemic caused a massive drop in aviation travel, we similarly saw a surge in aviation travel and airline travel after the pandemic began to wane. Even before the pandemic happened, I often spoke to families, including my own, that I think saw air travel as a tense experience, thinking about packing up the kids, thinking about driving to the airport, parking, trying to get your luggage over to the airport, trying to check in your bags, getting through security with kids, and the entire experience from one curb to the other curb, dealing with the crowds, the changes in the hours or the flight times and services. I remember being at Atlanta Airport in one of the busiest concourses, and there literally were 2 retailers that were open. It is absolutely amazing. Delayed bags, the list goes on and on. And this doesn't even come close to the challenging situations the passengers with disabilities experience when going through air travel. All we know when we find out that there are problems is that usually you get some alert on your phone or there's a notice on the screen that pops up and says things are delayed. And you don't have any idea why that happened. Was there a dog on the runway? Is there air traffic congestion? Is there, once again, a NOTAM system that went down? Are there equipment issues? We don't have any idea. All we know is that there are delays, and that experience causes extraordinary pressure, frustration, and anxiety. Now, you look back over the past several years and you look at what airlines have done with technology. I've got an app for the airlines that I fly on. I can figure out exactly where my seat is. I can change my seat. I can figure out what gate I'm going to. If there's a gate change, I can pull up a map and figure out how to get to the other gate. The convenience of that technology has been extraordinary. But that really is one of the few technological advances that has really improved the convenience of that overall experience. And so what we want to talk about at this hearing today as we approach the FAA Reauthorization bill this year, how can we look from curb to curb at every single one of those stovepipe systems that we go through, whether it's security, whether it's the airport, whether it's parking, whether it's baggage claim, whether it's air traffic control. How can we thematically improve the convenience, improve that overall experience for air travelers? That's really what we want to focus on today. I'll say it again, from curb to curb. We saw over the last several months where we had major disruptions in air travel. And again, the NOTAM system went down. The notice to air missions, a system that most people probably didn't even know existed. In other instances, we may have something going on with weather. Again, you may have air traffic control issues, and we don't know why. We've got to improve the technology, and we've got to improve the transparency behind that so travelers better understand, can better predict what's actually going to happen in their air travel experience. Now, in the last FAA bill, Congress included over 40 provisions trying to improve and address the consumer experience. Everything from review of causes of airline delays, addressing involuntary schedule changes, establishing an airline consumer advocate, improving the consumer complaint process. And there were also 12 provisions, many of which I know were advocated for by my friend here, to support passengers with disabilities. And as a result of some of those changes and as a result of data collection, we actually had a 370% increase in consumer complaints between October 22 from the same month of 2019, a 370% increase. Look, airlines, it's a deregulated industry, and consumers have choice. I think it's our job to help to preserve the choice that consumers have, ensuring that passengers can choose between the various airlines, the various airports, the various options. We have an obligation, I think, to ensure that the government's role in this, the pre-check, the TSA, going through security, we have an obligation to ensure that the air traffic control experience, it advances in technology and conveniences just as much as every other sector, because otherwise that one weak link in the chain is going to cause an adverse experience in air travel. So I'll say it again. I want to thank you all for being here. I look forward to hearing from your individual perspectives about what we can do to improve this overall experience for passengers as we craft the next FAA reauthorization bill. Thank you. And yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Garret.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your opening remarks, which encompass much of what we need to do, and are also in my opening remarks. This is our third hearing on the FAA reauthorization. Appreciate the subcommittee's attention and prioritization of the passenger experience. As Mr. Graves mentioned, the 2018 FAA reauthorization included more than 40 provisions to improve the airline passenger experience. We established a consumer complaints hotline, created airline passengers with disabilities bill of rights, and required review of airline cancellations, delays, and involuntary changes to passenger itineraries. We also included my bill that I've been working on for a long time, the SEAT Act, which requires the FAA to reestablish or to establish minimum dimensions for passenger seats on airplanes for safety. And the FAA never got around to doing it. They did get around to doing it, but after about 2 years, and they didn't have a proper study or sample. So it's very disappointing as a person whose life has been spent in government and thinking government can make a difference and a good difference in people's lives, and particularly consumers, to see the FAA just neglect to do what they're instructed to do by law, and that was to carry out this study. And it should have been a study with a relative sample that was reflective of the flying public, which it wasn't. There were no young kids, there were no people over 65, there were no people with disabilities, nobody with a dog, nobody with a bad day, anything. This is terrible. But we need to see to it the FAA follows what they're supposed to be doing and follow up on that. We'll continue to see that, I'm afraid we'll continue to see airline seats shrink. Not everybody's like JetBlue and increases the size of their seats, and they do a good job with that, I believe. While the 2018 law made incremental progress, it'll be made resoundingly clear today there's much more work to be done to enhance the passenger experience, particularly those with disabilities. The increase, Mr. Graves said, was like 300% in complaints for people with disabilities. And we can't forget Mr. Langevin, who was a star on this issue and brought it to our attention on more occasions than not. People with disabilities fly, and they should have the same rights as anybody else and be treated properly. Some of the problems are maybe staffing, and there's problems with the air traffic controllers with staffing, I think. There are problems with the airlines with staffing, because a lot of people during the pandemic decided, I'm sick of this job. I'm tired of it, and I'm going to have a better life. And they just quit their jobs. So we've got some people like Mr. Collins has got a good bill, I think. I hadn't studied it in detail, but on first blush it looked good, and first blush was good enough for me to co-sponsor it. And it'll give people more opportunity to use monies that have been put away in accounts to further their educational opportunities, but allow them to go into trades like the airline industry. And that'll help us if we get these people trained and an opportunity to go to work in these industries, which is most important. So thank you, Mr. Collins. That's a good bill. I also work with Tammy Duckworth, chair of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, of multiple bills to prioritize accountability and accessibility for aviation consumers and empower passengers to use mobility aids such as manual or powered wheelchairs. With a rebound in demand, we're seeing increased cancellations and delays by airlines. I was on a flight to Phoenix on Thursday. We sat on the tarmac in Memphis for about 20 minutes, and the pilot told us he was doing paperwork. And then after he get started up, he said, well, we've completed our maintenance work. I don't know what was going on, but it didn't make much sense. We had the highest cancellation rate in the decade in 2022, and the on-time arrival rate decreased by 77%. Consumers whose flights are canceled or scheduled delayed should not be forced to jump through hoops to claim their rightful cash refund. And that's why I'm working with Senators Markey and Blumenthal on cash refunds for flight cancellations act to restore fairness and accountability to America's air travel experience. We're also being outpaced by increasing infrastructure needs at our airports. We've made progress, but we need to help our airports have the monies they need to have the type of airports we deserve in the 21st century. We had first 2 years program that we passed with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the airport terminal program, it's awarded almost $2 billion to airports across the country. That bipartisan bill was so important to many airports, and Memphis got $14 million, which is much appreciated and much needed. There's more work to be done, and we hope to be able to continue to meet infrastructure and passenger expectations and needs. And with that, I look forward to hearing from our esteemed witnesses and welcome the opportunity to work with these people. And Ms. Pinkerton, I really welcome seeing you. I've known the Pinkertons chased Jesse and Frank James for years and years, and I've never had a Pinkerton before me. So on behalf of Jesse and Frank, welcome.
Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Graves, for calling today's FAA Reauthorization hearing on navigating the comprehensive passenger experience. Today we'll discuss ways to improve that experience. This includes preventing future flight disruptions, investing in airport infrastructure needed to accommodate the ever-growing demand for air travel, and ensuring we strengthen policies designed to support all passengers, including those with disabilities, to ensure they have a dignified and safe travel experience. Just 3 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the globe, causing air travel to plummet and massive disruptions throughout the global aviation industry. According to TSA, U.S. passenger screening levels fell as much as 90% in 2020 compared to similar periods in 2019, the sharpest aviation decline in history. Fortunately, the demand for air travel rebounded much stronger than anyone could have expected, and in 2022, more than 850 million people traveled on scheduled air carriers, an increase of more than 50% from 2020. And we celebrate that return to air travel. And yet that dramatic and unanticipated rebound created its own set of issues. Many commercial airlines were ill-prepared for the sudden spike in demand, which created staffing and operational challenges that led to more than 2.5% of scheduled flights canceled, with at least another 22.5% delayed by at least 15 minutes between June and August of 2022. The shutdown of the FAA's training academy for air traffic controllers during the pandemic also led to staffing challenges, further contributing to some of the widespread disruptions seen in recent years. Additionally, the recent NOTAM outage this January and the unprecedented number of Southwest Airlines cancellations last December show how other factors, such as insufficient planning, outdated technologies, and severe weather, can make our national airspace vulnerable to widespread disruptions. That's why in the wake of the cancellations last December, I, along with 25 of my Democratic colleagues on this committee, sent a letter to the DOT urging more action to protect consumers against future disruptions and to ensure each affected consumer is made whole. Stranded passengers should not have to decide between paying potentially exorbitant fees to rebook another flight or miss valuable time with family and friends. Furthermore, in the aftermath of the NOTAM outage, I joined Chair Graves and 120 of our colleagues in sending a letter to the DOT demanding answers as to why the NOTAM system failed and urging the FAA to take immediate action to ensure the stability of that system. To enhance the passenger experience, we must address the root causes of these mass disruptions to help prevent them from occurring and ensure passengers are made whole when they do. But we can't optimize that experience without addressing the infrastructure needs to accommodate them. The FAA's current forecast predicts passenger traffic will increase roughly 2% per year over the next 2 years. In the Puget Sound region, the number of airline passengers is expected to grow from 24 million in 2018 to as high as 55.5 million in the next 25 years. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided $25 billion for airport infrastructure, a historic investment that allows airports to modernize and expand terminals, reduce congestion, and address the anticipated rise in passengers. Yet there is more to be done. And to enhance that experience, the passenger experience, we have to invest in our airport infrastructure. So I look forward to hearing from Mr. Kevin Dolio, Director of Aviation for the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, and about how Congress can best enable airports to meet their growing passenger needs. And as we consider how to bolster the passenger experience in the upcoming bill, we must ensure that we consider all passengers, including those with disabilities. The latest U.S. Census estimates 42.6 million Americans have a disability, with many having mobility issues. And last November, this subcommittee held a hearing to better understand this community's air travel experience, including challenges with boarding the aircraft, inaccessible lavatories, and damaged wheelchairs and mobility aids. To ensure the passenger experience, we have to ensure that air travel is accessible, safe, and dignified for all passengers. I look forward to hearing from our good friend, Mr. Lee Page, with the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the PVA, about these issues and how Congress can work with stakeholders to help fill the gaps in aviation accessibility. And Mr. Page, thanks again for coming to educate us in front of this committee. In the upcoming FAA reauthorization, this committee has to examine all aspects of the passenger experience, from ensuring consumers are fully protected against flight disruptions, to improving the transparency of fees and other airline policies, to expanding airport capacity to accommodate the growth of future travelers. And so my thanks again to today's witnesses. Look forward to identifying the ways that we can help, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Recognize Ranking Member Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. We've got a lighting system in front of you for our witnesses. When the lights, there are three lights, there's red, green, and yellow. And when it's green, obviously it means go. That means you're on for 5 minutes. Yellow means you're used probably 4 minutes and 30 seconds, so you need to be winding up. And red means you're finished. Cut it off. Get the hook. As unanimous consent, the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered.
As written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Ms. Pinkerton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today. I want you to know airlines are doing everything in their control to constantly improve every aspect of the customer experience, starting from when customers search for and book their tickets and continuing until they have safely reached their destinations on time. Airlines compete aggressively to attract repeat customers. You all know
Sorry, Mr. Chair,
aviation
could you pull that, could you ask her to pull that microphone like right in your, yeah.
Commercial aviation is emerging from the most difficult 2 years in our history. It's hard to believe that air travel dropped 96% in the spring of 2020. Yet despite these challenges, nobody could have predicted the U.S. aviation system has remained safe, reliable, and resilient. Although we are constantly working to improve and have taken note of the recent warning signs that have put a spotlight on what our system needs to remain the gold standard of aviation safety. There are really two things that I think we need to do to improve the customer experience. One, it's about our people, and two, it's about technology. Airlines learned that in a post-COVID world, we need more employees to operate a smaller schedule. Simply, it takes it takes more people to operate fewer flights. This is due to workforce issues across all industries that I'm sure you'll hear from our other colleagues about. To address this, passenger carriers have expeditiously hired a record number of people, 100,000 people in the last 2 years. We now have the largest workforce that we've had in 20 years. However, we know a larger percent of our workforce has less on-the-job experience today, the pre-pandemic workforce. So to address that, we put a strong focus on training and proficiency, and we think it's paying off. One of A4A's top priorities for the FAA Reauthorization Bill is improving workforce development and diversity by strengthening the workforce grants that you all created in the 2018 bill, as well as legislation creating a federal loan program for pilots and mechanics. Additionally, we strongly support NATCA's request for addressing the controller shortage that has simply gone on for too long. FAA must update their staffing model and hire and train accordingly. Turning to technology, it's another ingredient for a safe, reliable, and resilient system. Despite losing $49 billion in 2020 and 2021, U.S. carriers have invested a record $26 billion in capital expenditures. This includes new planes, ground equipment, and technology. $6.2 billion of that expenditure in 2022 was spent on passenger experience, giving our frontline employees tools, and our own operational systems. But it's also critical that FAA modernize its technology as well. Most Americans are fully aware of the NOTAM outage that caused the first ground stop since 9/11. And there were also issues in January with the Miami ERAM system, one of our busiest airspaces in the country. The FAA's facilities and equipment budget that funds technology has been stagnant since 2009. It hasn't kept pace with inflation. The FAA needs both stable and sufficient funding. There are several multi-billion-dollar projects that are long overdue and haven't produced the promised results. I could talk more in detail about the fact that we're still using paper strips instead of electronic strips. We need to automate traffic flow, both on the surface environment and in the en route environment. And we also need a program that's called en route datacom. It's what controllers and pilots use to talk to each other. We need to move from a voice system that's subject to mistakes and move to an electronic text system that's going to be safer and more efficient. We have additional recommendations for the FAA bill, including ensuring that the FAA remains the single safety regulator for the national airspace system. And we also want to work with the committee to continue the work that you've done to incentivize sustainable aviation fuel. In closing, carriers remain vigilant in pursuing our goals of improving safety, reliability, and resilience, and a good passenger experience, all while keeping airfares lower than before the pandemic. In fact, airfares are 55% lower in real terms than before the industry was deregulated more than 4 decades ago. At that time, flying was just for the wealthy and privileged. Today, more than 90% of Americans have flown, and more than 50% of Americans have flown before their 16th birthday. The one sure way to bring back the bad old days of out-of-reach airfares and limited service is to turn back the clock and re-regulate carrier fares and service. We look forward to working with you on an FAA bill that creates an environment for a healthy aviation system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pinkerton. Ranking Member Cohen, we represent 2 traditional commercial airports, New Orleans Airport and Baton Rouge Airport, and it's kind of like having your 2 kids. And so we were tasked with having to figure out which one to testify, and you got to choose between your 2 favorite kids, right? I want to thank Mike Edwards and the folks from Baton Rouge Airport for being here, and Kevin Dolio from New Orleans. So we courageously asked the Airports Council International North America to choose for us. Mr. Dolio, representing New Orleans International Airport, I want to thank you very much for being here, and absolutely love your new facility. It is beautiful, and I hope everybody has a chance to visit. Mr. Dolio, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for making me the choice. But good morning, and thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Cohen, for having me and providing the opportunity to share commercial airport perspective in today's important conversation about passenger experience. Again, my name is Kevin Dolio. I'm the Director of Aviation at the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, and I'm also here today in my capacity as Vice Chair for Airports Council International North America, or ACINA. Airports across the U.S. approach the overall passenger experience with the same determination we approach our shared mission of ensuring the safety and security of the traveling public and airport workers. We strive to provide every single passenger who travels through our terminals with an easy, accessible, convenient, and enjoyable experience. U.S. airports would love to achieve the type of passenger accommodations we see at airports around the globe, but we have significant work to do. Just this morning, ACINA released its biannual infrastructure needs study that shows overall airport infrastructure needs in the next 5 years are $151 billion, or about $30 billion annually. Airports around the country are suffering from a lack of adequate infrastructure funding, and unfortunately, despite our best efforts as an industry, our facilities show that lack of investment. Even with these all-time high infrastructure needs, the airport industry is committed to a comprehensive approach to enhancing the passenger experience, and FAA reauthorization would be an excellent opportunity to narrow the funding gaps to make this a reality. The Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport is the largest commercial service airport within a 350-mile radius, and nearly 85% of the people traveling by air in Louisiana use our airport. In 2019, we opened a new terminal after years of planning and piecing together the finances to make it happen. Airports are the front doors to our communities. Our new terminal has drastically improved the first thing visitors see when they arrive in New Orleans. It's a 972,000 square foot terminal featuring 3 concourses, 35 gates, 2 new parking garages, a surfing parking lot next to the terminal, and remote economy garage with shuttle service. The terminal was built with the passenger experience in mind and contains many of the features a modern passenger expects, but we just weren't able to provide in our former terminal, such as electrical outlets available at 50% of the seats and gatehold areas, fast free Wi-Fi, water bottle refilling stations post-security, mother's rooms, a pet relief area post-security, 3 curbside check-in locations with easy access to the short-term garage, an efficient inline baggage screening system, and a consolidated checkpoint. Passengers also get to feel the spirit of New Orleans through our award-winning concessions program, which features a host of local restaurants and shops. The new MSY terminal was but one of New Orleans Airport's many infrastructure needs. We were able to fund it by using debt and utilizing a combination of other available sources, leaving us with less flexibility to fund future projects. As we look forward to the future growth of the New Orleans region, a modernized airport infrastructure funding pipeline will allow us to better position ourselves to meet the increase in demand for even more connectivity at MSY. A passenger rail line connecting the cities of New Orleans and Baton Rouge is currently under development, and a key component of this new service is a stop at the New Orleans Airport. Our next significant project is to develop an intermodal station and a roadway and ultimately an automated people mover, which will provide the last mile connection from the new rail stop on the south side of airport property to the existing passenger terminal on the north side of our property. This multimodal project will provide improved connectivity for passengers, employees, and residents, among other economic and environmental benefits, and is a critical element to the next phase of MSY expansion for the entire Gulf Coast region. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Doyo. My metric of success for your airport is if the line is longer at Cafe Du Monde, famous for the
It
beignets,
is.
and Cafe au lait, or going through security. And I think Cafe Du Monde's line has been longer about 2/3 of the year. So I think that's a good thing.
I understand it's their best producing location in the city.
Wow.
Thank you, Mr. Dolio. I know Mr. Graves is interested in Baton Rouge to New Orleans. I want to see a flight from Memphis to New Orleans. And Ms. Pinkerton ought to be able to take care of that.
Got to work on that.
But thank you, sir. Mr. Santa, you here to represent the air traffic controllers, and you're recognized for 5 minutes to do so.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Cohen. Oh, there you go. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Cohen, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the members of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. NACA is the exclusive representative of approximately 20,000 employees, including FAA air traffic controllers and other aviation safety professionals. We also represent 132 federal contract towers and several DoD facilities. I am an air traffic controller, having worked at the New York Terminal Radar Approach Control Facility and, since 2001, the Washington Air Route Traffic Control Center. The National Airspace System moves over 45,000 flights and 2.9 million passengers each and every day across more than 29 million square miles of airspace. Although it is the safest, most efficient, and most complex system in the world, we are always working to improve efficiency and mitigate the risks. NACA and the aviation industry share the same primary concerns: funding for air traffic control staffing and training, as well as for equipment and modernization programs. Staffing and training have been concerns for many years, and despite some progress, they remain challenging. Currently, the FAA is near a 30-year low in the number of fully certified controllers. By the end of fiscal year 2022, the FAA had 1,200 fewer certified professional controllers than it had a decade earlier. Despite meeting its self-imposed hiring goals since 2016, the FAA followed its flawed finance-derived controller workforce plan. That plan, although met for the past 6 years, has resulted in 10% fewer certified professional controllers than a decade ago. Recently, the FAA announced that it would be raising its hiring target to 1,800 controllers. That's in the fiscal years 2024 to 2026. This represents the maximum throughput at the FAA Training Academy in Oklahoma City. But hiring trainees short-term will not solve this staffing crisis immediately, because it takes 1 to 3 years of on-the-job training after graduating from the academy. And 60% of those employees will make it to certified professional controller status, with 40% either retiring or being unsuccessful. Importantly, this past November, Acting Administrator Billy Nolan directed the FAA's Air Traffic Organization to restart the Collaborative Resource Work Group and partner with NACA to collaboratively determine the number of CPCs, that's Certified Professional Controllers, at each facility that is needed to meet the operational needs at every ATC facility. This will help reduce delays and increase the passenger experience. For several months, NACA and the FAA worked with the MITRE Corporation, Center for Advanced Aviation Development, to update the CPC operational staffing targets. The FAA must use these new CRWG numbers in its annual controller workforce plan, provided the Congress with complete and transparent view of the operational workforce needs. For months, the FAA has failed to implement this. Although we are proud of the collaborative work that has been done, we are deeply concerned that the FAA's Office of Finance and Management, AFN, will seek to undermine these operational targets, as it has done in the past, by calculating fantastical costs over 10, 15, even 20-year periods. If so, these calculations should be completely discounted. The 1,800 new trainees in each of the next 3 years are cost neutral because they are already included in the FAA's budget. It is going to take a sustained commitment to hiring and training to a local that outpaces controller attrition to meet all of the FAA's operational needs, including integrating new users and new technologies into the NAS. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the FAA's facilities and equipment budget has remained flat since 2009. This lack of increase in funding over the past 13 years has forced the agency into a fix-on-fail model. We've experienced that recently. Were required to prioritize mandatory costs of the NAS over the sustainment and increases in technology. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I do look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Page, you're representing the veterans that have disabilities, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and we recognize you for 5 minutes and appreciate your attendance.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Cohen, members of the subcommittee, Paralyzed Veterans of America, PVA, thanks you for holding this important hearing. Consider the experience of air travel passengers with disabilities and development of the next FAA Reauth. Nearly 40 years ago, President Reagan signed the Air Carrier Access Act, or ACAA, into law. It requires air carriers to provide disability access accommodations to passengers with disabilities. Despite those protections, the current air travel experience for passengers with disabilities, particularly wheelchair users, is at best frustrating and sometimes worse, unsafe. Wheelchair users must surrender their customized wheelchair for stowage either in the cargo or, in case of certain manual chairs, inside the cabin. The passenger must then be assisted in boarding process by airline staff or more often their contractors. Many of these individuals have limited training, are unable to effectively communicate with passengers, and are required to physically lift and transfer individuals with significant disability without sufficient staffing or equipment. In order to board an aircraft, wheelchair user must use an aisle chair. An aisle chair is a device designed solely to navigate the narrow aircraft aisle. The chair are often too small for individuals, have limited padding, cannot be propelled by the user, and are prone to tipping over. Once on an aisle chair, the passenger is then maneuvered backwards onto the aircraft and pulled down the aisle to the passenger's seat. Even if the person is not injured in the transfer process to the aisle chair, being transported down the aisle is another place where a person can receive injury. In my case specifically, every time I'm on an aisle chair, my hips hit every armrest on every seat all the way back to my designated row. Once there, I then have to rely again on personnel to physically lift me from the aisle chair and in some instances over the armrest and into my seat. Because my knees nearly touch the passenger seat in front of me, other passengers seated in my row have to climb over me to get to their seats. This is not an easy task for people who have trouble straddling over me. In all cases, it's an experience not expected by those who have to sit by me, but one I have learned to endure when flying on an airplane. Upon arrival at their final destination or connecting airport, wheelchair users too often find their assistive devices have been mishandled. Between 2019 and 22, over 32,000 wheelchairs and scooters were mishandled by airlines. If an airline damages, loses, or delays a passenger's wheelchair, it is a significant and serious problem that endangers the health and limits their mobility and independence. In the worst cases, it can mean the end of the trip and an individual has to stay in a hotel bed while they wait for the repair of the wheelchair. It can also mean weeks or months of having to use their own damaged wheelchair or an ill-fitted loaned wheelchair. Despite a significant focus in the last reauthorization on improving safety and dignity of passengers with disability, needle is barely moved. In fact, the percentage of wheelchairs and scooters mishandled in 22 was the same percent as mishandled in 2019. Problem with commercial air travel is that aircraft do not have accessible features needed to safely accommodate passengers with disabilities. Passengers will continue to be injured and wheelchairs delayed, damaged, or lost until they can travel on the plane using their own personal wheelchair and transfer to a passenger seat or stay safely seated in their own device. We strongly believe the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, H.R. 1267, must be included in the next FAA Reauth. To improve the air travel experience for passengers with disability, this critical piece of legislation, which is currently supported by 30 veterans, disability, and consumer organizations, would provide safe and dignified air travel for the passenger with disability by requiring airlines to operate aircraft that meet accessible standards to improve enforcement of the law. Specifically, the ACAA would require Transportation Secretary working in consultation with the Access Board formulate standards to address effective boarding and deplaning for the personal wheelchair, visual accessible announcements, in-flight entertainment, seating accommodations, lavatories, and storage options to assistive devices. 5 years after the standards are finalized, airlines would need to operate aircraft that comply with those standards. Again, H.R. 1267 would also require the Secretary to refer complaints to the Department of Justice. Referral of cases to DOJ would put commercial air travel in the same position as other providers of mass transportation. It would recognize that the Air Carrier Access Act is not customer service standard, but a civil right. We believe that increased aircraft accessibility and improved enforcement options will lead to safer travel experience for passengers with disabilities, both now and in the future, PVA members and other people with disabilities have waited long enough to safe access travel. The time to act is now. PVA thanks you for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Page. Thank you all for your testimony. We'll now turn to questions from the panel. We first recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, the chair of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, Mr. Crawford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've had the opportunity to visit New Orleans recently, so I can attest to the veracity of the chairman's comments. It's a spectacular airport, Mr. Dolio, and I appreciate you being here today to share some of your insights. And I understand, based off of the recent survey from Airports Council International North America, that U.S. airports have $151 billion worth of infrastructure needs over the next 5 years. Aside from additional funding, how would it be beneficial for airports to have more flexibility on airport improvement program funds at their airports?
I think I picked up the full question. Besides an increase of funding, how can airports with more flexibility invest more in landside needs, terminals, and so forth? Of course, our ask is for more funding, but at the same time, we're also asking for consideration of more flexibility in how AIP funds are used. So if at least that, if there's not more funding, give us the ability to use AIP funds for more landside type projects as well, or terminal projects, and that would assist in improving the situation in a lot of terminals around the country. But at the same time, the funding gap is so wide that you'd only be shifting. We'd have a greater ability to invest in terminals, but at the same time, we have airfield needs that the AIP program is geared to take care of. That to shift from one place to the other, it's not a whole lot of shifting you can do. At least you hit a point where you're starting to impact critical project needs on the airfield. So the real answer is additional funding in the programs, but minus that, at least the flexibility to use the AIP funds in a broader way.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Ms. Pinkerton, in your written testimony, you described a few next-gen programs that could improve safety and the travel experience for consumers. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about these programs and what progress is being made with regard to operationalizing those programs, what that means for consumers on the airlines.
Yes, I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail, but overall, as this committee is very aware, the FAA's record on implementing next-gen programs is lacking. Projects, there are IG reports and GAO reports replete with examples of programs that are over budget and not on time. The programs that we've identified that we think are important for both safety and the customer experience start with the terminal environment, so the airport environment. I talked a little bit about this. In this day and age, air traffic controllers are using paper strips instead of electronic strips. And it's not just a paper versus electronic. It's the information that's behind the electronic strips and how that information gets used to create a more efficient environment in the airport environment. So what we're trying to get toward is using that electronic flight strip information, merging it with other information so that we have a model that tells planes, now is the time to start your engine, now is the time to push back, and now is the time to taxi out so that you can be in a certain line to take off. It might sound like a small thing, but when you add just 15 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute of efficiency, it adds up in the entire system.
Well, one of the things you hear when you're on the airplane, the pilot will come on the intercom and say, we're going to finish up some paperwork and then we're going to push back. And I always thought that was just sort of a figure of speech, but it sounds like it's really not. Like we're really finishing up actual paperwork.
Oftentimes that is the case, whether it is a maintenance issue or whatever type of paperwork. You're right, that is the case. But I think it can be better managed. And I also want to go on to the other program that I mentioned, Datacom, which is, and again, Mr. Sand is here, so I, of course, will defer to his expertise, but this is the program that allows air traffic controllers to text instead of using voice instructions. What does that do? Number one, it stops mistakes from happening. People misspeak or they mishear. It allows controllers to text several planes at a time, avoid this convective weather, et cetera. So again, we've talked about data communications for over a decade. And I will give the FAA credit. I thought they did a pretty good job in getting those out into the airport environment, but it's not in the en route environment right now, and it needs to be. And then last but not least, when I was talking to the staff yesterday about a national planning tool, you know, the reaction was, we don't have that. Well, it's kind of like the NOTAM system. We have a version of a national planning tool for our air traffic system, but it is decades old again, and it's outdated. So we need a one large program. It's called the Flight Data Management System, and we've been told that this is going to be delayed because of budget concerns, where the command center, the people who evaluate the nation's air traffic control system, can see everything that's going on in the system at once, all of the traffic management initiatives, all of the ground delay programs, and can use that information.
Ms. Pinkerton, I hate to cut you off, and it's been very insightful comments, but my time has expired, so I have to yield back.
Gentleman yields back and recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You need to go?
Oh, okay.
I yield to Ms. Peltola.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cohen.
But do it quick.
Okay. My question is for Mr. Page. When I traveled here from Alaska just a couple days ago, I ran into some folks from Alaska, and one of the people in the party had suffered a traumatic brain injury. And she brought to my attention that she has needs that are not necessarily accounted for at the airport. And I think across the state and across the nation, I think this is a reality for a lot of folks who have traumatic brain injury. They may not have parking, or they may not have access to a disability seat because of the nature of their injury not being as obvious. Maybe help with finding quiet spaces or not as bright spaces. And I just wondered if you could speak to traumatic brain injury and the work that you're doing for disabled folks on that front. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm not sure, this woman obviously has a disability, and it was great that you had the conversation with her. You know, if she needs access in the airport, there's a lot of different accommodations that the airport can provide, because they're required to be accessible by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, if she's on the airplane, that has requirements under the Air Carrier Access Act, which, you know, as you said, I don't know, does she use an assisted device like a wheelchair or a scooter or anything like that? So whatever her needs are, she needs to express them to a person to ask for that reasonable accommodation, I would say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
If you want to go ahead and finish your 5, we'll cycle them back in.
No, I'm good. Thank you. I wanted to keep my promise. It'll be quick. Thank you.
Okay. I'll be quick. Mr. Page, you told us about your experience of getting on a plane and how difficult it is, and when you got in your seat, your knees bumped up, et cetera. You know, we had a bill, we passed the SEAT Act to have the airlines study getting folks off the airplane within 90 seconds, which is the rule they're supposed to abide by, and they didn't any people with disabilities in their test. Could that possibly be an appropriate test? And the reality is, if you're on that airplane, are you basically giving up for dead? Because how would you ever get off that airplane?
Well, truthfully, they're supposed to give me a conversation when I get on the plane about how to evacuate a person with a disability. I've only had that evacuation conversation maybe 2 or 3 times in the days that I've been flying. You're exactly right. I'm not a 90-second person to get off the plane. The only way I can get on the plane is with the aisle chair. I'm 6 foot, over 200 pounds, and all my muscles have atrophied due to spinal cord injury. So the only way for me to get off in a dignified way would be via an assisted device.
You've got more experience than any of us here about ADA and the needs for ADA. You go to a ball game, they've got seats for you, good seats behind home plate, and where you got leg room. Same thing in a concert hall. Is there any place that is as bad as airplanes for people with disabilities?
Well, for ADA compliance, yeah, you're right. That's Title III public accommodations. You've got the ballpark. You've also got transportation compliance under the ADA for all mass transit like Greyhound, city buses, the subway, Amtrak. Currently, right now, the airlines are governed under a different law, the Air Carrier Access Act, which passed 4 years before the ADA. So that's why I'm advocating for a standard of access for a path of travel to get on the plane in a wheelchair. That way I would avoid the aisle chair, which is a lot of times where myself and people with disabilities encounter injury because you have to transfer on the slope of the jetway. As I mentioned, this aisle chair is a pretty precarious device. It's tippy, and then the persons that have assisted me in the past, they're used to pushing, truthfully, little old ladies from point A to point B, and then they stand up and walk on the plane. I'm a person, as I said, I'm 6 foot, 200 pounds, and dead weight. So,
Thank you, sir. Ms. Pinker, let me ask you my final question. You heard Mr. Page's testimony. What can you tell us the airlines can or will do to help people like him who are veterans, who are injured, and have difficulty getting out? They're dead if you don't do something about it. What can you do to make airplanes the seat sizes larger, the pitch better, the width better, to improve the passenger experience, but also the safety?
2 parts to my answer. One, I want the committee to know we are committed to doing a better job in making sure that folks with disabilities are able to travel safely and comfortably. Our CEOs, very recently in the last couple of months, publicly announced that they were recommitting to improving wheelchair damage issues. They're creating advisory boards at each of their company and inviting the disability community to be on those advisory boards, and they committed to frontline training of their employees. I think those 3 actions are critical and demonstrate our commitment. With respect to the seat size, frankly, Congressman, for the A4A carriers, our seats are actually getting bigger. They're not getting smaller. We're putting in bigger seats in the premium economy. Our smallest seats, which are on our regional planes, unfortunately, 50-seat planes are going away, which is not good for small community service. But as a result of those 2 trends, essentially, I would say for our carriers, seats are actually getting bigger.
Thank you very much. I would just suggest, I took a flight to Atlanta recently, and I was between 2 people who I guess you'd call husky. You ought to find a way to just have one person in a row that's a husky. I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dolio, over here. Mr. Dolio, my colleague, Mr. Crawford, asked you about flexibility in the Airport Improvement Program, which are federal dollars that come back to the airports. And you lamented the fact that there was a shortage in revenue, that flexibility would help in that program, but you still needed more funds. Can you talk about the other sources of revenue that airports have and how that plays into it? Particularly, my follow-up question is going to be about the passenger facility charge.
Good. Okay. The airports have different funding sources to use for capital projects, of course. PFC program, the AIP grant program, airport funds that remain and are usable after all expenses are taken care of, are pretty much the bigger pots. And right now, we have the temporary bill program that will run for another 3 years. Now, you heard the stats earlier that there's $30 billion a year need in airport infrastructure development. Those funds combined over airports, the AIP program, PFCs, airport revenues, equate to about $13 billion a year. So there's still a big gap. So something has to give or something has to be done to start closing that gap. The PFC program, when it was stood up in 2000 at $3 and later, in 90 at $3 and 10 years later was about to $4.50, has lost value over time with inflation. So it doesn't buy you the same thing it did then. Bumping the PFC would be a very significant help, and it would be airports self-generating the funds from local users of airports and airport facilities. So it's a big gap. And again, the flexibility would help, but really we need to bump the programs and provide more funding.
Sometimes when Congress wants to raise taxes, we call it a user fee as a euphemism. But the passenger facility charge never goes into our coffers here at the federal government. Right. It truly is a user fee because it goes from the user to the airport. Can you talk about how you use those fees responsibly and what you would do if we did increase the cap for the first time in many years, allowing you to collect your own revenue?
It's with the big infrastructure needs, a lot of it in terminals and landside. What the PFC program does is gives you the flexibility to use those funds in those areas as opposed to everything on the airfield. The AIP program is more geared to airfield improvement. So as PFC revenues increase, airports have a better ability to improve terminals, improve the airfield as well. We can use those funds on the airfield. They can provide matches to grants that we receive and picking up that gap. And the more we can do with grants and with the PFC program, it's less we have to do with debt and less costs that flow down to the air carriers that fly in and out of our facilities. So we're always, as airport operators, we are consistently looking for ways to fund our needs. And no one's, and I can tell you, I've been a CEO in 3 airports. The needs were different in each, and we adapt to the needs. New Orleans, the new terminal was essential. In St. Louis, we went through a significant upgrade of the existing facilities, and that was sufficient there. In San Antonio, a new terminal and concourse was needed to replace a World War II facility. So it's different needs everywhere. None of us are out building monuments to our greatness. It's just essential needs in those communities. And the PFC program has gone a long way in helping us develop those facilities, but it is losing value with inflation.
I'm sorry I don't have much time, Mr. Santa, but I had a question for you, and hopefully the chairman will indulge me and allow you to answer it if I go over time. We've seen recent reports, and I don't know if they're true or apocryphal, or if these are things that happened in the past and we just didn't pay attention, but we've seen recent reports of, I don't know how you characterize them, but I'll call them near misses, when planes are taking off and landing and get closer than we're comfortable with at airports. I've seen those in social media. I don't know if it's more than normal. Can you let the public know, are there an increased number of those incidents? And if so, what do you think the cause is?
Well, some of the recent events that have been in the news are, they're troubling for us. It's an increased amount of risk that we're unwilling to accept right now. But they really are inspired and invoked, unfortunately, by lack of staffing. When you control more traffic with less operational positions, you introduce risk into the system. Now, the NTSB is investigating those. We partner with them. We're part of the investigation to ensure that we learn from those events and we don't repeat those. But ultimately, working more traffic, 6-day work weeks, 10-hour days introduces risks to the system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, to answer Representative Massey's question, I'd like to enter for the record the safety alert for operators from the US DOT, which was the readout from the Aviation Summit, which partially answers the member's question, so without objection. Okay. Without a chair. Thank you very much. And for Mr. Santa, though, what do your members view as the primary issues contributing to these incidents and your top recommendation for addressing them?
I'm going to go, thank you for the question. I'm going to go right back to my previous answer. Staffing is a challenge. Technology increases or capacities are a challenge. Funding is a challenge. We can talk about every one of those individually, but when you're working more traffic and you're combining sectors and you're under control of more airspace with more frequency congestion and the lack of tools to accomplish that, you have less redundancy, less resiliency, less eyes working a specific amount of traffic. It can introduce risk into the system. We need to increase the amount of air traffic, certified professional air traffic controllers. Unfortunately, we have a solution. It has not been implemented by the FAA at this point. It's a collaborative decision that needs to be introduced to the FAA's controller workforce plan, because what has been introduced for the past 10+ years has resulted in a huge attrition through our 313 facilities to a number of 1,200 less controllers in a workforce that only has 10,500 certified professional controllers right now. It's a staggering amount, and it results in 6-day work weeks, 10-hour days, reduction of positions that are open.
Can I ask you to, do you have a specific timeline? If this workforce plan was in place and given attrition and production of the pipeline, how many months, how many years would it take to come to that number that is necessary to deal with the amount of traffic that we have?
If the new collaborative controller workforce plan is implemented and it's funded and it's supported in its entirety, we're still going to have a few years of challenges due to the amount of time it takes to certify, 1 to 3 years, and the amount of attrition just in new hires of about 40%. But we can comfortably get better every single day because our training initiatives and our training programs are robust. We're working towards more effective training, quicker, but still energized and still accurate training so that we have the best aviation professionals working safely.
And briefly, Ms. Pinkerton, A4A is 100% supportive of this action, is that correct?
Absolutely. We agree, and staffing and technology, on the technology front, not to talk about individual incidents, but in Austin, they don't have the surveillance technology that most other airports have. Austin is the fastest growing airport in this country, and it needs to have that surveillance technology.
Great. Mr. Page, what's the single most, we're trying to think through like this FAA bill we're putting together, so I'm trying to hone in on what's the one thing, right? So what is the single most important thing the DOT can do to improve the travel experiences for passengers with disabilities from your point of view?
Thank you for the question. From our perspective, as I mentioned, basically standards and more enforcement of the Air Carrier Access Act. As you know, all other modes of transportation in this country are governed by ADA and the Department of Justice. And DOT right now, in order to gain better access for people with wheelchairs, you need a path to travel to get on the airplane, and then go to a seat and make that transfer. That way you would alleviate problems of the aisle chair. And then you could store the wheelchair under the cabin, or some manual chairs inside the cabin in a closet, or if you're in a power wheelchair.
Can I stop there? I have 20 seconds left. Yesterday, you gave me a number. Can you describe, not describe, what's the cost of, say, the chair you use versus the cost of someone with a higher level disability versus like
Yeah.
the one at the hospital?
Yeah, there's a significant cost. I mean, as you know, to get this type of chair, I get a doctor's prescription. It's about $4,000 or $5,000 for my chair. A big power chair can be anywhere between $25,000, $30,000, $40,000. So when these things get damaged, damage can be minor, such as ripped upholstery, especially the big power chairs. If their power drive is damaged, in case of our members, the VA comes and fixes them. But a lot of the airlines have contractors to do the fixing also. The question is timely fix, and what do we do in the meantime?
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was conferring with my good friend, Mr. Massey, on some things. First off, thank you all for being here. To our air traffic controller, I wouldn't take your job for anything, or your jobs. You're doing 6, 8, 10, 12 things. I come from a law enforcement background, and I know that 911 dispatchers are the first call takers that keep us all safe and get what we need going. So I want to thank you for what you and the other professionals have done, like I do always to our 911 dispatchers and communication specialists. I will also say that we've had some folks here talk about airports. I want to tell you that I'm proud of the international airport in my hometown, the Duluth International Airport. And I'm also proud of the Minneapolis Airport. I think those are two of the finest facilities to fly into, and as you know, Minneapolis is rated the #1 airport in the country. So I just want to say that aviation is so critically important to our economy. I really appreciate the comments. And as I was talking to Mr. Massey, the PFC and the AIP grants, what I really, and I spoke to some airport executive directors just yesterday, what I really think that we in Washington, D.C. have to understand is those executive directors at the airport, they make the best decisions for their airport. Now, what's needed in Duluth, Minnesota may not be needed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Butte, Montana, or Dallas, Texas. And so I come from local government, and I believe in local control, and I trust our local officials to make the best decision for their respective airports. So with that being said, my wife and I also are blessed to have a special needs child who has Down syndrome, and it's severe and profound, so he's at the lowest level of the scale. And to fly with him is a bit tough. And I would say that the question I would ask is, and I appreciate all of the comments, the question I would ask is to Mr. Dolio, what have, you've mentioned something, but what have you done for the disability community to make it easier? And I will just tell you that my child has difficulty in the narrow seats. He has difficulty meeting the connections because his walking is slow. What have you done to facilitate the passenger travel for those with disabilities? Because I think it's extremely important because when we can do that, we will take our child more places, right? Because the factor in our child having the disability plays into our decision of flying. And so could you just elaborate on that, please?
Okay. I'll give you first just a real quick general on airports overall. In the bill program, the FAA's ATP component of it, Airport Terminal Program, Of the funds that airports have applied for and been awarded through that program, about 60% of the projects have accessibility and ADA issues dealt with in their programs. In New Orleans, we were fortunate in developing a new terminal. Instead of modifying our facilities, we built in things that help accommodate those with disabilities, adjusting the countertop heights. The countertop heights are set. The parking positions on gates at airside is very important as it drives the slope on your jet bridges. And your jet bridge, the slope has to meet certain requirements to effectively accommodate the disabled. Adult-sized changing tables were built into our facility. Unisex and companion care restrooms were built in. Prayer and meditation rooms were part of it. We have comfort dog programs. We have the Hidden Disability Sunflower Program, which uses a lanyard to identify travelers with hidden disabilities. And our volunteer workforce
And I think that,
very helpful.
I just have a short amount of time. I really appreciate that.
Okay.
The idea that you recognize where children and people have disabilities is extremely important. We, those of us who are blessed, need that assistance from you. So I would say continue to keep it up, and I just appreciate the list that you gave us. And Mr. Massey and I will continue our conversation in a moment. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I commend the chair for such a wonderful and diverse panel that we have today. And I thank the witnesses for your testimony. And aviation plays a central role in our national economy, from expanding our industries to connecting people to their loved ones. And our disabled citizens and people in America are no different than the non-physically disabled. And they deserve to be able to connect with their loved ones and participate in our economy just as everyone else. It pains me to hear the experience of Mr. Page in having to go through a torturous journey in order to get to his seat on a airplane and to be about the business that he is about, which is the Senior Associate Director of Advocacy, Paralyzed Veterans of America. So, I mean, so many of our citizens who've given to our country through their service to our military, and they, for whatever reason, end up disabled. They deserve to be able to participate in seeing their families and in attending funerals, business conferences, going on vacation. It should be something that those veterans who've given so much to us, they should be able to enjoy. And not just veterans, but just everyday disabled people. They are intelligent. They are college graduates like Mr. Page. They have jobs that contribute to the welfare of us all. They make a contribution, and we have to find a way to make it easier for them to travel on airlines. I appreciate what the airlines have done, what the airports have done, and what the employees do to support our disabled, but we must do more. Mr. Page, thank you for your service to the country. Airline employees and contractors are responsible for properly handling cargo, which for passengers with disabilities includes mobility aids such as wheelchairs. However, too often we see that this equipment isn't being handled with the appropriate care required under federal law. For example, last year we saw many Paralympians arriving at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport to compete in the July 4th annual AJC Peachtree Road Race. Another one is coming up this year, annual affair. Numerous passengers reported damages to their wheelchairs, and for some, their chairs never even arrived. Can you speak to gaps in training among airline workers on the stowage and handling of specialty mobility aids that impact passengers with disabilities?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, one of the big things, like a lot of our members, you know, have gotten tired of having their wheelchairs damaged, and so they drive to their destinations across the country. The below-the-wing personnel that assist in putting wheelchairs into the cargo hold, what would best be needed is, you know, when people get on the airplane, they take everything out of their wheelchair that they can possibly take into the aircraft so it doesn't get damaged or lost in the cargo bin. The real deal is a lot of mobility devices that are larger or power-driven, depending on the aircraft, may have to be put on their side going up the conveyor belt, which is not necessarily the way it's designed, and that's because the cargo door opening might not be large enough to accommodate the wheelchair going into it. So personnel have to, you know, adjust the assistive device to put it into the cargo hold in order to get the door closed. Once it's in the cargo hold, then hopefully they put it upright in its seated position. Other times it's, you know, surrounded by other baggage or other issues that may be, you know, near or on top of the assistive device. But that's, in general, the way wheelchairs are loaded into cargo from the experience that I've known.
Should there be better training?
We would hope that's a good idea. I'm not sure how the training for those employees is right now.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Dakota, Congressman Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that makes America so great is our national commitment to infrastructure. I think we understand that interstate commerce means that we have these networks that bind us together. So we've got interstate highway systems and universal service and rural electrification. And of course, the nation's air network is also one of these things that binds us together. And we know that the larger a network is, the more value it adds to everybody on the network. And so that makes me think about my very rural state, where in 80,000 square miles, we only have 2 non-EAS airports. And so the 3 EAS airports are incredibly important to that passenger experience. I know we think the passenger experience starts when people walk into the terminal, or maybe when they park at the terminal. But the reality is that if not for the EAS program, there would be South Dakotans who would have a 400-mile round trip before they got to the airport. And so, Ms. Pickerton, talk to me a little bit about the EAS impact on the rural passenger experience.
Absolutely. The EAS program is a critical part of that network that you talk about. Airlines are committed to ensuring that we continue to operate a network that serves small communities. I will say there are a lot of challenges on small community service right now, whether it is a healthy EAS program or the pilot supply issues that are impacting small community service in particular that need to be addressed. But, you know, as airlines, we want everyone to fly, and those rural communities are a critical part of that robust network.
And of course, you and I are both talking in code, but EAS means Essential Air Service. I should have said that. And of course, it's a long-standing program. As Congress looks to the future, ma'am, how should we approach EAS?
That's a tough one. We haven't necessarily taken a detailed position on the Essential Air Service program. I can tell you some of our carriers are active participants, some are not. But I think from our perspective, you know, obviously those there are monies that are used from overflight fees right now that help fund that program. And I think the program needs to be evaluated to make sure it makes sense and is rational. From our perspective, I would say the most important policy issue that we're struggling with when it comes to small community and medium community service is the pilot supply program.
You mentioned in your oral testimony that the 50-seat airplanes are moving out of service, and that particularly impacts rural communities, you said. Talk to me about what's going on there.
Well, essentially, I'm sad to say that several of our network carriers have identified the fact that with the regional flying, they're simply not able to hire enough pilots. And if you don't have the pilots to fly, what you do instead is use larger planes so that you're flying maybe the same amount of people, but you're only flying once a day with a larger plane. So you know, there's been a discussion with us in the pilot community. We have increased the wages now of regional pilots to try and address some of those issues. But I think there is still an issue with how expensive it is to become a commercial pilot. I mean, you not only have, you know, you have a 4-year or 2-year education, but then you have the training to get your 1,500 hours, and that takes a lot of money, and that's why I was very appreciative of those who have supported the student loan bill to help pilots and mechanics bear that cost.
And so it isn't a problem with the fleet, the planes themselves. It really just comes down to the human power.
The human problem and the economics of the service, yes.
Yeah. All right, thanks very much. Madam Chair, I would yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Davids from Kansas for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you to Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Cohen for holding this hearing today. You know, the FAA reauthorization is going to mean that 2023 is a critical year for this subcommittee, and we absolutely have an opportunity to shape the discussion about what the future of our national airspace looks like. And we obviously want to make sure that we remain the gold standard of safety for all airspace around the world. Well, I mean, we've got some work to do. I can point to just in the last 6 months, we've seen a full-scale failure of the NOTAM system, a handful of incursions, and some near misses on airport runways. And although these obviously represent a challenge, we still have the safest airspace in the world. And that reputation, I believe, is critical to inspire confidence amongst all of the people who fly every single day for work or pleasure or fun work. Just kidding. In the course of this reauthorization, though, you know, we're going to have the responsibility of helping our domestic air carriers ensure that their customers are getting where they need to go. And that needs to be both safe and affordable and timely. And, you know, I've been hearing from some of my constituents about frustrations revolving around ancillary fees that they might be encountering while they're traveling, whether it's baggage fees, the refund process, fees for families sitting together. And I know the U.S. Department of Transportation has implemented the Airline Customer Service Dashboard to help give consumers a quick glance view of the progress that's being made by airlines in making these, getting this work done. And, you know, with only 3 domestic carriers guaranteeing adjacent seats for children under 13 and an accompanying adult at no additional cost, I think it would be helpful to understand the inflationary pressures, whether it's rising costs of fuel, how that sort of thing impacts businesses in ways that maybe a lot of folks don't understand. But I do think that, you know, we can't just expect all of the costs to be passed along in the form of fees. And so I'm curious, Ms. Pinkerton, if you could just give the committee a bit of a level set on the ancillary fees, on maybe what your member airlines are doing to simplify the fee structure or to make it easier for consumers to understand, and then maybe what the work with DOT is looking like to ensure that the consumers understand the fees and have as enjoyable experience as possible.
Happy to, because it's in our interest to have our passengers have a good experience, because we want repeat customers. And with respect to, I'll take a couple of the themes that you mentioned. With respect to family seating, though, and by the way, I applaud the department's dashboard, because we're all for transparency. It's great. The problem, though, is in particular on the family sitting together, they have a very prescriptive approach. For example, they chose the age 14. Well, there are carriers who are doing everything they want, but they chose age 13 or 12. And I think the problem with a kind of a one-size-fits-all with respect to some of these issues is that it commoditizes air travel in a way that actually hurts competition. And I can assure you that having robust competition is the best way to ensure that customers get the best product at the best price. And deregulation has shown that. Airfares in real terms are 55% below what they were. We serve more communities now than we ever have. You have more competitors per origin and destination today than you've ever had. And frankly, again, to go take it back to family seating, you know, you mentioned a family seating fee. None of our carriers charge a family seating fee. That was a great talking point. I understand that, but our carriers have great policies. They're on the DOT's website. They're on their website. We have a website, so we're very transparent about them. But I'm afraid that having this fee, which some carriers did have, not A4A carriers, is being conflated with basic economy, which is simply, again, it's part of competition. You've got ultra low-cost carriers, you've got low-cost carriers, and then you've got some network carriers. And you know, you've got Southwest that doesn't charge bag or seating fees. You've got the network carriers that if you're part of their loyalty program, you don't pay a fee. That is the beauty and diversity of our system, is that there are choices.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll look forward to continuing the conversation as we go through the reauthorization
Absolutely.
Process.
Happy to.
I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Chairman Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I was just out in the hallway, and I feel sorry for all those people that accidentally got in the TikTok hearing line that thought they were coming here. Awful. In any case, Mr. Dolio, thanks again for being here. You and I have spent a lot of time talking about that curb-to-curb experience and discussed how you have a number of different stovepipe entities, whether it is a parking lot concessionaire, it's the retailer at the airport, it's the TSA, or others that are running different components. You're the airport, and you have to deal with all these different entities. Can you just briefly describe how you work with these different entities to think through that passenger experience?
And I'll give you an example of a curb to curb, a curb to aircraft door type service we offer. We have, I mentioned in my opening that we have a remote parking garage with shuttle service. In that garage, as we were planning to move to the North Terminal, that garage is on the south side of the airfield. With shuttle buses, if you have baggage you're going to check on a flight, it can be a bit of a hassle. Lugging luggage up the stairs of a shuttle bus, onto the bus, and then off on the other end. You allow a little more time to arrive at the airport, take the shuttle, check in at the airline ticket counter, and then proceed to the checkpoint. We've worked with our parking operator and a baggage handling service that's certified by the FAA and TSA to handle luggage for air carriers, and set up a curbside check-in program inside that garage. So you can pull up in your vehicle, check your bags, get your boarding pass, then park, and load the shuttle bus bag-free and hassle-free. When you get around to the North Terminal, you go directly to the security checkpoint. You're already checked in and nothing further to do in the terminal, but go through security and off to your gate. So that's one service. And we have the touchless pay with concessionaires. Through the pandemic, we worked very closely with our concessionaires in the spooling down of their operations, providing plenty of information to them and working with them hand in hand to spool down in a very organized way, and then continued providing information as traffic was slowly coming back to a very organized and well thought up ramping back up as traffic was coming back. So we were able, in working in partnership with our concessionaires, to provide a good level of service for the traveling public throughout that period without putting undue burden on our concessionaires.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you also offer valet parking at your
valet
airport as
parking.
well. And based on your testimony and answers, it sounds like Ms. Burns prepared you well for this hearing today.
Okay.
Ms. Pinkerton, we talked earlier, and look, I'm a huge fan of the apps. It's amazing, the convenience, all of the information right there from where my bags are going to be at baggage claim, gate changes, everything that happens. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the other entities and how you work together? And look, I want to be really candid. Air traffic control seems to be the kind of black box, and Mr. Santa, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about the controllers, I'm talking about the technology. We're operating in antiquated situation compared to some of the other aspects of this experience. Ms. Pinkerton?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, air carriers have invested $26 billion in planes and $6 billion in 22 in technology for apps, giving our employees technologies that enable people to make connections instead of miss their connections. We've invested in our own operational systems. We're transferring a lot of on-campus systems to the cloud. And these are conversations, I think, unfortunately, we have great conversations with airports and work very closely together to make sure we have the finest facilities. But you're absolutely right. On the air traffic control side, I think that what we were talking about, the facilities and equipment funding, and again, since 2009, it's been flat. That's one thing, but accountability is another issue. So there has been a lot of money spent, and not much progress has been made, frankly. And I think that it is going to require continued oversight of the FAA. It's not just the 3 programs I talked about, or even NOTAMs. NOTAMs are the tip of the iceberg in this system, I can assure you. The system in Miami, the ERAM system, Rich can talk about STARS and other programs. So the number one frustration for passengers is delays and cancellations, most of which, frankly, are caused by severe weather.
I'm out of time. I want to thank you. Look, Mr. Santa, I am really curious and I'm going to submit some questions for the record for you. I'm just curious about, is it the acquisition system? Is it the technology that's being used? And I apologize, I don't have time right now. I'm going to have to submit questions for the record, but I really am curious about your perspective on this and how we ultimately improve technology all across that entire experience. So I apologize, I'm out of time, but thank you for being here. Madam Chair, yield back. Looks like I'm the chair. Recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and of course, thanks to all the witnesses for enriching the conversation as we move forward with FAA reauthorization. One of my main priorities for aviation amongst workforce and safety is consumer protections. And do you know what doesn't protect consumers? Greed, corporate greed. Airline mergers continue to cause market concentration and promote monopolistic practices in the industry. The corporate greed is further exacerbated when executives and shareholders pad their pockets with stock buybacks. It ultimately impacts the customer experience. Ms. Pinkerton, I want to ask you several questions. Brief replies would be much appreciated. What are your thoughts on airline CEOs jacking up the price of seat selections and baggage fees to again pad the pockets of their shareholders?
Congressman, respectfully, airfares are as low as they've ever been. They're 55% lower than they were when we deregulated. So there are carriers that charge fees, there are carriers that don't, but all of that, when you look at fares and fees together, people are paying less in real terms than they ever have before, and that's why they are flocking to fly. That's why demand is so strong.
And I fly Southwest, so I get that point, but others do charge. And now that the payroll support program has expired, what is your perspective on airline CEOs racking up in profits on stock buybacks while cutting jobs or lowering wages? Is that fair?
Actually, airline employees, their average wage is 37% higher than the average American job. We have good jobs, good paying jobs. With respect to, there's been a lot of conversation. The stock buyback restrictions were part of PSP. We fully complied with that. I do want you to know in the past, we looked at, our revenues coming in, 59% go to our people, 20% get reinvested in our product, 13% go to pay debt, and 8% go to stock buybacks and dividends. So that's a pretty good priority, if you ask me.
But now the program has expired, as you point out. We've got to make sure that corporations are investing in workers, product safety, supply chains, and not continuing to buy back their own stock. We've got to address the skyrocketing cost of airline tickets by preventing price gouging and unfair practices when they occur by corporate airlines. We must lower prices and invest in our workforce, not continue to buy stock backs. And that's why I introduced the Reward Work Act to protect our airline consumers. Mr. Page, how important is it to have a stable, experienced service workforce to support travelers? And how will establishing strong wage and benefit standards for service workers at our nation's airports help make the airport safer and more accessible for passengers who utilize wheelchair assistance?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that's a very good and fair question, especially since, as I mentioned, one of the functions to get me on and off the airplane is the access with the aisle chair. A lot of times, depending on the airport, depending on the airline, airline employees will do that function. Sometimes it's contracted out to airport employees or others. I don't know who they are specifically, but they'll wear different, vests or badges or jackets. But the reality is, I'm not, a higher paying job might induce better service.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record the Center for Progress report entitled Airport Service Workers Deserve Good Jobs. The report shows the unacceptable conditions for many working people and travelers are happening while airlines receive $13 billion in our public resources every year. There's no objection.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gooden from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank all the members of the panel. I also want to thank my friends at Airlines for America. I actually don't have any complaints about the passenger experience. I appreciate the fact that we have so many, well, don't thumbs up just yet. I have appreciation for the options that the American public has. If I want to fly an airline that doesn't charge for bags, then I perhaps don't pick a certain airline. If I want a no-frills experience, there are options out there. And I believe in the concept of just not choosing to fly a particular airline if I'm not happy with the services they do or don't provide. There's two issues I do have a problem with, though, and these are things within the control. I also want to go back to some of the irregular operations. I feel for the American traveler that only flies once a year and has a bad experience, because I do believe those are one-off experiences. I fly every week, and for the most part, it's good. Every once in a while, it's bad, and usually it's out of the control of the airline. And I wish the average American citizen understood that. If they're not a frequent traveler, they don't. But I wish the airlines would calm down with the credit card ad pitches during the flight. Passengers are captive audience members, and my constituents that I've heard from, myself included, are tired of being forced to endure an advertisement every time they get on the plane. And in fact, some of those are misleading, because every time I fly, I'm told about a special offer that's available only today. And in the last year, I think I've probably heard 50 or so special offers that are available only today. So I hope you'll take that back. Another issue that's very near and dear to me is the ongoing border crisis. And many of our carriers here are playing a large role in the transport and spread of illegal immigrants inside the country. In fact, miles are being donated back to airlines who transport illegal immigrants in exchange for shuttling illegal immigrants across the nation. In November 2021, I raised concerns regarding the transport of illegal immigrants across the country by major U.S. airlines, including Southwest. Southwest responded to my concerns regarding their involvement with a rather lengthy, seemingly unresponsive letter. While they did not deny any of my allegations, they repeatedly asked me to discuss my concerns with Southwest before raising them. They also categorically stated that any concerns regarding the enforcement of immigration laws should be raised with the DHS or TSA instead. There have also been reports of minors traveling alone and being misplaced at airports. While we have been made aware of such cases due to the quick response shown by their families, there are possibly far more cases of unaccompanied children crossing the border illegally and at risk of being exploited or trafficked. But airlines like Southwest want no part in verifying these passengers. Major U.S. carriers like Delta came out opposing President Trump's zero-tolerance policy in 2020. And I would ask Airlines for America, why don't these airlines transporting illegal immigrants and unaccompanied children at risk of being trafficked remain silent now?
Congressman, I am not steeped in that particular issue. I apologize, but I am happy to get our subject matter experts and get back to you.
Thank you. I'll answer it for you, though. The answer is they're making money off of this, and they're also concerned about being underwhelmingly woke, and I think that's disappointing. I wish airlines would stick to flying passengers, get away from credit cards, and follow the laws and not assist in the border crisis. It's disappointing, and I hope airlines will work with me on that. I also, Mr. Doilio, forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, I appreciate you joining us today. Last year, I was informed by the TSA that illegal immigrants without proper documentation were using arrest warrants as alternate forms of ID when presenting before airport security. This is not opinion, this is fact. Passengers without any identification used the arrest warrant that they were given at the border to get through security. We've also learned that in some of the less secure parts of the airports around baggage claim areas, they're easily accessible from the arrivals area, and baggage verification never happens, as we all know, be it from baggage, whether there's baggage threat or any kind of reckless activity. Do you think there's any measures that you as an airport administrator would suggest we enact to protect our passengers at the airport?
And Ken, I picked up every other word. I'm sorry.
What specific measures, if you had any suggestions to improve passenger security at the airport, would you advocate for?
Well, we do have many security measures in place, including LEO presence at our airports and key locations. The entirety of our facilities are monitored through our access control system. There's secure doors that keep people out of areas where they could do harm. And security is really very extensive in airports. There's many layers in security, not all that you see, but we do a really good job of keeping our facilities secure, and it's an ongoing and fluid area of the operation. As you find issues or potential vulnerabilities in your facility, you take steps to close those gaps as well.
Thank you. And you've got a very fine airport down in New Orleans. Congratulations. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Payne from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask our witnesses about accommodations for passengers with hearing loss who may not be able to hear announcements on board aircraft or in a busy airport. Ms. Pinkerton, passengers with cochlear implants often find it difficult to hear in-flight announcements, including potential delays or changes to flight status due to the loud background noise from engines. What steps do airlines take to ensure all passengers are able to hear these announcements?
Thank you for the question. We have supported since 2016 changes to the in-flight entertainment that's on the seat back that would allow you to read those instructions. I think Mr. Page can back me up here. We agreed to that in 2016, and we're still waiting for DOT to act.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Dolio, passengers with hearing loss have reported similar concerns for announcements in the terminal. These can include boarding announcements, flight delays, gate changes, and announcements asking passengers to come to the ticket counter. Putting this information on electronic screens at the gate greatly aids travelers with hearing loss. Can you please share with us what airports do to accommodate these passengers and what improvements you can make?
You touched it. The best way is the visual prompts or visual messaging on the FIDS monitors throughout the terminals. So as announcements are being made or critical announcements, it also scrolls on monitors for the hearing impaired to pick up what's being said.
Okay, I thank you. And it's, sometimes a community that it gets lost in these type of areas. So I appreciate everything you can do in order to make the experience for hearing impaired as pleasurable and easy as possible. So with that, I'll yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Keene for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses who are here today. We are holding these hearings to focus on improving the passenger experience for airline passengers. With that said, this committee is laser focused on exploring new ways to make airlines travel easier, quicker, and more efficient. This committee should strive to make the airline passenger experience from the time they arrive first at the departure airport to when they leave the destination airport as convenient and as enjoyable as possible. We can do this by deploying and prioritizing innovative technology for our airlines, those who work to keep our skies safe. By modernizing the NOTAM system, the FAA can avoid instances like the system outage on January 11th of this year. But we must not forget that safety is our first priority. As Ms. Pinkerton states in her written testimony, safety is and should be the bedrock of the industry. So, Ms. Pinkerton, what factors are within the airline's control when it comes to making sure that you can operate your schedules? And what factors can airlines not control? And what are you doing to control reliability and improve the reliability on those factors within your control?
Yes, so the factors that are not within our control that cause most of the disruption in the system are weather. So for 2022, weather was responsible for 53% of the cancellations, and the NAS was responsible for 10% of the issues. Those aren't within our control. What is within our control is about 37% then, to 38% of the issues, and that a lot of that comes, frankly, from our crew timing out. As you might have heard in my opening statement, we have really done incredible work in the last 2 years. We've hired 100,000 people. So we're at an all-time high in terms of our employees, because we've learned you need to have more employees now to fly a smaller schedule. We're still flying 10% less than we flew in 2019. So getting people is within our control, and then making sure they're trained and proficient on their job is the next thing that we can do. You know, again, safety is our top priority, and we've identified ensuring our folks are trained and proficient as being one of the most important things that we can do. But again, most of the systems issues are not within our control.
And when it comes to FAA reauthorization, what should the committee be addressing in the legislation to ensure that DOT is transparent and accountable when it comes to cancellations or delays that are not caused by airlines?
Well, I do think it's important for DOT to look at Mr. Santa's proposal on staffing, because as I said, we're essentially overstaffed right now, and they are understaffed. So I think they need to take that seriously and address it. You may have seen yesterday, there was some acknowledgement of the staffing issue in New York. The department announced that they're going to provide slot relief, which we highly commend the department for doing that, slot relief in the New York area. But we have to be honest with ourselves, why is that happening? It's happening, as they said in their order, because there are staffing issues. And so I think that's probably the number one thing the department can do.
I would say in the New Jersey area, coming from the 7th Congressional District in New Jersey. Mr. Santa, do you have any update on when the Collaborative Resource Working Group led by the NACTA and FAA will have its final report that can be shared with the public on ATC staffing targets?
Yes, thank you. The report was finalized through the collaborative process on January 31st of this year, and it has been submitted to Acting Administrator Billy Nolan, and as of right now, it has not been implemented. It's important to get it into this control of workforce plan. I know that deadline is coming, and as Ms. Pinkerton said, we are working with 8-year-old stagnant numbers, talking about at Austin specifically. They have an 8-year-old staffing guideline number.
So again, what can we do to help with that?
We need that CRWG number that was collaboratively derived to be introduced and utilized in the controller workforce plan that the FAA owns and that presents to Congress. So it's transparent. So everybody knows the health of every one of our 313 facilities.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have Mr. Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of the witnesses here today. Mr. Page, I want to just specifically thank you, not just for your work on behalf of veterans, but all folks who have mobility challenges. My father-in-law is one of those people, so the challenges that we face in flying and accommodating people with mobility challenges directly impacts how often he gets to see his grandkids. So this is something I care deeply about, and I appreciate your advocacy and know that you have someone on this committee who's going to work hard at that issue. Pivoting to some of the challenges that we face in a dense community like the 8th Congressional District, in 2017, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics conducted a study that tracked roads, airports, and other transportation to arrive at a noise metric for each area of the nation. New Jersey, including several towns in my district, was found to be one of the loudest areas on the East Coast. While Newark Airport has proposed changes in recent years to mitigate noise pollution, flight routes are a contributing factor to the noise pollution my constituents suffer from every day. Ms. Pinkerton, can you explain to the committee how airlines work with air traffic control to encourage flight routes that take into account noise pollution?
Absolutely. First of all, I do want to acknowledge the fact that noise is an issue that's important to us. We spent a lot of time working on it, and we've invested in quieter planes. Planes are much quieter today, 50% less quiet, more quiet than they were just 10 years ago. We're working very closely with the Federal Aviation Administration when new procedures are implemented. Usually a community group is stood up to look at those changes and talk through them. So it's a collaborative effort. It's not an easy one. Because, you know, there is noise associated with different traffic patterns. Sometimes a different traffic pattern will actually create less noise, but because it's new to a certain community, that raises concerns. So we need to work through all of that, and I think we are.
Yeah, as you continue to consider sort of different factors, just know that sort of these densely populated urban areas who already are subject to so much noise pollution, it's really a challenge. So anything that we can do to alleviate that for those particular communities would be appreciated by me and folks from similar districts like Congressman Payne. I'll stay with you, Ms. Pinkerton. For delayed flights that originate in Europe, are American air carriers currently providing compensation to those passengers per EU Flight Compensation Regulation 261?
No, actually, I think the EU 261 has been a disaster. A lot of money has been spent, but it's not money that's spent to fix the problem.
But is the compensation going to passengers?
It is. It's not going to fix the problem, which is the single sky is what they call their modernization effort in Europe. And that's what we need to do. We need to invest that money in technologies that are going to solve the problem at its root cause so that we don't have irregular operations that disrupt passengers.
I would say part of it is a recognition that flight cancellations, disruptions do impact passengers who are consumers within the industry. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, sir,
That flight cancellations and disruptions impact passengers who are consumers within the industry.
Absolutely, and when we cancel a flight because of something that's within our control or even significantly delay that flight, we do compensate passengers.
Sure, and I would just say that in thinking forward, you talk significantly about competition. I do think if airlines could come up with a model that really protects consumers, understands that the challenges they face, and continue to work on that so the consumer feels like that airlines are engaging in meeting that challenge, I think would be extremely helpful.
Absolutely. We believe whether it is the safety issue or the customer experience issue, our work with the disabled community, that more can be done, and we're committed to doing that.
Well, I appreciate, and you know that you have partners here who want to create
Yes.
A great system for all passengers across this country, no matter where they're originating or where they're landing, and hopefully we can do that work together. So thank you so much. I yield the
Absolutely.
remainder of my time.
Mr. Bean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, T&I Committee, our panelists. We're glad to have you here. I'm going to talk about some of my biggest fears, our top three. The first is clowns. There's nothing that we can do about that today. But the second, number two, is turbulence. Turbulence on an airplane, and it can be very unnerving. I think we've all experienced that. There's stories of some very harsh turbulence that has caused injuries. Mr. Santa, is there anything we can do? Is there anything that you can direct a plane to fly in a different direction or higher or lower to avoid turbulence? Is that something we can do?
Thank you for the question. It is, first of all, when we talk about terrorism, we take it very seriously, even though we're sitting in the seat controlling the traffic. But it is very taxing to the workforce. The reports and the interrogations of the pilots to find the smoothest rides and then present those to subsequent air flights through there, it's important to us. We know the challenges, and we've seen some of the occurrences recently, and that really brings right back to the question. The more work you have with combined sectors, and the more work you have without the extra eyes and the redundancies and the people sitting next to you to take your reports and to pass them on to the next aircraft, it hurts us when we don't have the bodies to do that.
Very good. No, thank you very much. Number 2 on the list is getting trapped on a plane on a runway that's just parked there. I know it's gotten so much better, but Ms. Pinkerton, does that still happen? Is that still a thing where planes can sit? What are the limitations of sitting on a plane that's not ready to go, but not they don't want to bring them back to the terminal to let them disembark? Does that still happen?
Congress did pass the rule to prevent long tarmac delays. So if a plane is on the tarmac for an excess of 3 hours for domestic, 4 hours for international, there are that's a violation and penalties.
Is that too long though? Even that doesn't 3 hours sound like
it rarely happens. Remember
when it does,
45,000 flights a day. 2.5 million people, it rarely happens, but one time happening is too much. I completely agree with you. Interestingly, talking back to this control and not control issue, I fly every week like you do. And I was on a flight last week. We got onto the tarmac, and in Florida, they created a metering program for us taking off. It was a Central Florida issue. And so all of a sudden, we were on the tarmac, or on the runway, because of a Central Florida ground delay program, essentially. So not our fault necessarily, but what do we want the pilot to do? Do we want him to stay there and take off, or do we want him to go back to, interestingly, at about 2.5 hours the way through, just to show you how complicated this is, the pilot says, I'm going back. Do you know why we went back at 2.5 hours, even though I would have rather stayed for another 30 minutes? Because we waited 2.5 hours? Because the pilot's timed out. And those
hold on a
types
second. We've got challenges, and I want to get my last question in before we go. And lots of things, you've given lots of full testimony to read, so thank you. But I want to get to everybody, and we're entering the lightning round where I've got 1 minute and 20 seconds left. So under 10 seconds each, what's the one thing, and I'm going last, so you've already answered a lot of questions, but what's one thing that this committee needs to know about air travel that possibly we could change? Mr. Page, one thing. Bigger seats.
One thing, better access for people with disabilities.
10-4. And thank you for your coming in and letting us know that. Rich Santa, what say you?
It is safe, but we can do better with efficiencies. And the passenger experience is getting people to make their connections and to start their vacations on time. And we can do that with better staffing and better technology.
Very good. The near misses, we're going to, just with staffing, we'll correct those. Is it just me, or is it the press saying there's more near misses than there have been before? Should we be worried about the near? I'm worried about the near misses. That is on my list as well. But what say you to the near misses?
We are all worried and concerned about the recent events, and we evaluate those, and we put precautions, and we fix those challenges on a day-to-day basis. Huge, robust safety team.
10-4. Thank you. Mr. Kevin, what do we need to know?
More support to help airports meet their very critical infrastructure needs.
Very good. And Ms. Sharon, last for you.
The system is safe. There are incidents. We are addressing those incidents, but aviation is safer than any other mode of transportation. But what we need to do is we need to solve our people problem, and we need to do better implementing technology.
Thank you very much. I yielded my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. And next we have Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If you're concerned about turbulence, you want to be concerned about climate change, because everybody tells me that's going to be making it worse. I've seen heads nodding. I wanted to kind of talk about the disability issue, and I appreciate you being here, Mr. Page. And it was really gratifying for me to hear both the chairman and the ranking member and a number of members of this committee say we need to do better to serve our disabled passengers. And I certainly agree with that. I think of Judy Heumann, who just passed away, and her championship of this issue. And also Mr. Langevin, who had a couple of bills last session that I'm honored to carry for him now at this time. We're going to introduce we have introduced some amendments to the air carrier access bill that was passed in the 80s, thanks to the ranking member. And also, we're going to be introducing Wheelchairs on Airplanes Act with Mr. Stanton. And so I welcome anybody to sign on who's so concerned about this issue. You know, we hear all kinds of things. It's non-accessible laboratories, it's equipment that gets harmed, it's difficult to get on and off, can't find a place to sit, going through security. All of these are things that we can address with this legislation. Since we introduced it, I introduced it, and again, I thank Mr. Langevin. I know what it's in there, but Mr. Page, could you talk about how important it would be to pass that bill and some of the specifics of it that you see making a big difference?
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Titus. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that bill is pretty important, HR 1267. There are two main big issues which I've already talked about, which is better access for persons with disabilities to get into the plane, a path of travel, meaning it would require the Secretary of Transportation in consultation with the Access Board to write standards of access. That would allow a wheelchair to roll onto the plane, go to a designated seat that I could transfer, then my chair would either be put underneath the plane in the cargo hold, or in some cases in a closet if it was there. It would also allow a power wheelchair to roll on and go to a designated spot and tie down, much like...
We do that on buses. Why can't we do that on planes?
Pardon me?
You do that on buses.
Yeah, I was going to say, much like all other modes of transportation currently. The other big aspect of that legislation you're talking about is the referral to the Department of Justice for more enforcement. Currently, the Air Carrier Access Act, Department of Transportation levies fines for violations, and the last significant fine was in 2016, I think, for $2 million, which, you know, in the last reauthorization, we gave the authority to the department to issue fines for bodily harm or wheelchair damage and tripled those fines, and they've done nothing since then.
A lot of complaints are submitted and nothing that really gets done about that we hear about. How about the problem with the batteries? I know Mr. Langevin was taken off of a flight even though he had proof that his ion battery met the standards. Could you address that as an issue?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's disheartening that the airlines didn't allow him on. I think FAA has said that those type of batteries can fly. I'm not sure what the mix-up was that day, but what needs to happen is that in those instances, airlines need to go by what the FAA says.
Yeah, so the airline had a standard that was different from what the FAA said was acceptable, and he had the proof of that with him, and they still wouldn't let him
I think
fly.
the problem is a lot of times it's arbitrary when you get to the gate. It's what somebody on that flight knows and what somebody on another flight knows or not.
So just need to make that clear directive, so it's a standard across all the flights and all the airline companies. Well, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on any of this?
Well, I just want to say that I do agree that there's a need for clarification of the standard. Right now, the way the standard is written, and it's actually PHMSA, that says that you may take a battery up to X size. And so as a result of that, carriers do have discretion, and I think that's where the confusion comes in. But I think PHMSA, DOT, and the FAA need to sit down and come up with a standard that people can understand. Some people will, for example, some carriers, if they're operating over the Pacific Ocean, they're going to be reluctant, and they're going to use their discretion to say, no, we're not going to take 3 of that size lithium battery on the plane at this time. That may be understandable, but it needs to be codified.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. I will yield such time to myself. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Page. I want to thank him for his service in the past, and I want to thank him for his service now. We appreciate you. I want you to know that. Secondly, I think with anything, there has to be a little humor. So I fly out of Philadelphia when I do very often, once in a while Atlantic City, believe it or not. But I was really pleasantly surprised. So I was flying from Phoenix to Philadelphia. Philadelphia looks better, it looks nicer, it was shinier, cleaner, some new stores, everything was great. The best part of it was, and this is really true, it never ever happened to me before, but some of you fly, I guess, probably more than I do. I fly a few times a year. He had such good tailwinds, the pilot did, that we got there an hour and 5 minutes early. I mean, even he thought that was quite exceptional. So that was wonderful. So I'm walking around with my chief of staff saying, boy, things really, and they are, some things really are getting better. But as you would have it, and it's a Philadelphia tradition, baggage retrieval. Went to get the baggage, the whole thing broke down, so the hour and 5 minutes we made up, we used up waiting for the baggage. And it just kind of struck me as funny, as much as you move forward, sometimes every couple steps forward, you might take a step backward. But whatever use that has, I don't know. To me, believe it or not, I was in a good mood that day, so it was kind of humorous because we did get our baggage, so that was good. As you all know, we're in a pivotal time in aviation. Technologies are changing in the airspace, and our legacy systems are really in dire need of modernization, a great deal of them, and we all agree on that. It's important that Congress get this FAA reauthorization to ensure that the United States of America leads the world in aviation in the 21st century, and we got to get it right. I direct my question to Mr. Rich Santa. They were leaving you alone for a while, so I figured I'd pick on you. President of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and the FAA has claimed that the Next Gen program is operating. It has expressed a desire to evolve Next Gen into something more appropriate for the challenges of today, and I feel that as well. I think that's a good point. There's also a strong desire among stakeholders to improve the FAA's integration of advanced aviation systems, as well as improve this agency's modernization of legacy infrastructure. What role, and this is the question for you, what role should the Next Gen organization play in addressing the challenges of the new entrant integration and modernization of infrastructure?
Thank you for the question. It all acts together, right? The funding for FAA Reauth needs to be stable and predictable so that we continue the programs that make sense and we can replace the programs that are outdated. Many of our radar systems, our separation systems, everything that we work is past its useful life. And we are on a fix on fail due to the lack of funding. When we talk about NOTAMs, when we talk about the radar issues, when we talk about STARS or ERAM, they are all either needing replacement or already slated for replacement. But everything has been paused. Everything has been pushed to the right due to the lack of stable and predictable funding. We have been stagnant since 2009 with our F&E. FAA's report says that we need about $6 billion to do that, and we're still getting $3 billion to do what we need. So FAA Reauth needs to address that so that we can modernize the system, we can handle the new entrants, we can reduce delays. Ms. Pinkerton talks about the 10% that's allocated at an AS. We can do better than that if we're adequately funded and adequately staffed.
And I think that's a good point, and I think the modernization is very much needed. I mean, it's hard to really accomplish the hopes and the dreams that we have, quite frankly, if you're using old tools. So I appreciate that, and I know that's going to be a subject of discussion I've put forward. I hope that maybe if you get a chance, you take a look at it, an FAA plan of my own, and I'd appreciate that. You know, we spent literally years working on this, and I'd be interested to see what you thought of it. With that, I'm going to ask Ms. Scholten to speak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for coming before the committee and helping us understand the state of the passenger experience in air travel today. Perhaps not as exciting as the TikTok hearings that are happening out in the hall at present, but certainly of import to Americans across the country. I represent Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, which has a long history of participation on this committee. Congressman Vern Ehlers was a senior member for almost 20 years. My district stretches from the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan's 2nd biggest city, home to Gerald R. Ford International Airport, to the Lake Shore. Grand Rapids is one of the fastest growing airports in the country. It reached pre-pandemic levels of air travel, almost 97% before almost any other airport in the country. Undergoing currently a major terminal overhaul. This is an effort to relieve some of the constraints that they have been experiencing reaching these levels so quickly. This question is for Mr. Dollier. Mr. Dollier, much is made of the passenger experience, as we've been talking about today, but as you know in your testimony, passengers also spend hours at the airport itself prior to boarding. The terminal experience can vary widely from airport to airport. As a mom who has to travel with children and has traveled with very young children, I can personally attest to some of the difficulties that can be experienced. Can you speak to the importance of a modern and efficient airport enhancing that passenger experience, and in particular, developing a smooth curbside drop-off and pickup experience?
Let me say first, you have a very fine airport.
Thank you.
And they're being very proactive in going through the program they are now to make improvements and get ahead of the curve, if you will.
That's right.
That's an issue facing airports around the country. As I spoke to earlier, many of our facilities are older, in need of improvements, in need of growing capacity to meet growing demand in the facilities. And as you go through making improvements in airport facilities, you also plan and build in improvements to services offered to the traveling public, because the traveling public does spend a good bit of time in your airport. So there's many different ways to accomplish that through your concessions program, through services such as the parking operation I described a little earlier today, to parking reservation systems, to security reservation systems, to reserve a spot to go through the checkpoint at certain times, and to ensuring as airports are able to construct or add capacity, improve their facilities, because airports are older, and most were developed before the advent or before T&Cs came on the scene. The congestion at curbside airports has worsened over time. But as we're able to go in and make improvements, we can make those type corrections too, to ensure that truly from curb to aircraft, you're having a good experience. So there's many different ways. It really takes the funding needed, but the funding is pulled from sources that really don't impact the budget.
Thank you. And specifically thinking about family travel or group travel, family travel with young children, can you talk a little bit more about anything specifically that's being done to accommodate those parents traveling through airports across the country?
Well, a couple things I mentioned earlier as I was going through accommodations made in airport for disabled travelers also as a benefit for families. The unisex or family restroom facilities. If you're traveling with a pet, we have a pet relief facility beyond the checkpoint, so it's on the secure side of the facility. The Mix in Your Concessions program. You have to give consideration to young travelers as well. You'll see activity centers in some airports around the country. And airlines are making accommodations to ensure families are seated together as they board aircraft and so forth. So I think all of the stakeholders work to help make the experience for family travel better as well.
Thank you so much. We are very proud of our airport and the expansion that we're doing there. So I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
I was a consultant for 10 years in the industry. They were a client at one time. They were one of my favorite
Oh,
clients.
fantastic. You'll have to come visit us. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I noticed you guys didn't say anything about Philadelphia. I recognize Mr. Collins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm new here. I'm in the trucking business, been in the trucking business for 30 years, so I'm in the same business you're in. It's just that y'all go a little bit faster than we do. I like to just ask questions and just pop some answers real quick. Ms. Pinkerton, sometimes my dispatchers and people that take my freight will just take freight, even though I've got trucks parked on the side with no drivers. Is that a case? Are y'all allowing people just to book flights and add flights and with planes that are just sitting with no pilots?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question for me? I want to make sure I understand.
Are people booking flights that you know you don't have capacity to have?
Oh, no. In fact, we're flying 10% less than we flew before. We're overstaffed, as I said. We hired 100,000 people. We've got more people on board now than we've ever had before. We have the capacity. The system doesn't have the capacity. We don't have enough air traffic controllers, and we don't have the right technology.
And you don't have enough pilots?
And we don't have enough pilots for the small community service, correct?
Okay. And that was what Congressman Cohen was speaking about, what we're working on with the 529 savings plan. So a lot of my questions were answered in a way, but Mr. Santa, I want to kind of go straight over to the FAA because I think it's a back office problem myself. What was the average age of air traffic controller before the pandemic?
First of all, I want to say Philadelphia is one of my favorite airports. I don't know that I know the average age. I can certainly get that to you.
Okay. And they shut down the training schools during the pandemic?
That is correct.
And nobody aged during that time?
That is incorrect.
Is there an age limit on hiring at the FAA?
There is. It's generally 31 years old to be hired, and then we have to retire at 56 due to efficiencies of our profession.
Is that something that needs to be looked at?
No, it's very accurate. It's very sincere. We're highly professional individuals working a very difficult and stressful job.
All right. Technology improvement. I heard Ms. Pinkerton say that, if we got rid of the little cards, it may say 15 seconds, just say. So you do 45,000 flights a day. That's 112 hours in one day that you save. It adds up quick. What else do we need to look at technology-wise?
Well, the first thing we need to look is our legacy systems for replacement, upgrade, and modernization. And then we need to look at tools that are going to help us be more efficient. That always takes funding and staffing to accomplish. So that is sort of the second stage. The first stage, because when you partially fund a program, by the time it's implemented, it's either outdated or it's no longer useful to the community. So we need to solve the staffing and funding issue first, and we will appropriately be able to handle the increase of air traffic and the new entrants.
All right, I think that leads into my next question. And how many people at the FAA are still working from home?
It represents mostly air traffic controllers and safety professionals, and I would say a very small fraction of those still work from home, and it's because that's where they're most utilized.
I'm not speaking about the air traffic controls, I'm speaking about the FAA itself.
Once again, I can get that answer for you. The people that NACA, the members that NACA represent,
It's 1/3.
What's that?
It's 1/3. I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm Dolio. Passenger facility charges. Are they divided between the two airports, departure and arrival? How does that work? The $4.50.
It's the originating airport.
It's always the originating? Okay. So it's not divided out among all airports or any type of, okay. All right. And then lastly, Ms. Pinkerton, do the airlines oppose raising that fee?
Yes, and the reason is, whether you call it a tax or a fee, doesn't matter, you're raising the cost of flying for the public. And what I will say is, look around. New Orleans just built a big, beautiful terminal. Look at New York, LaGuardia, JFK, Newark's now coming on board. You know, 10 years ago, the airports might have had a reason and a need, but there's a difference between wants and needs, and a PFC increase is not needed.
One last question. I can't go without asking this. Mr. Santa, changing NOTAM from notice to airman to notice to air missions, did it improve technology or safety?
No.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Dolio, I represent the Central Coast of California. Many people call it paradise, as I do, which is home to Santa Barbara, Santa Maria, and San Luis Obispo airports, which are the finest and my favorite airports that I have. And I know San Luis Obispo Airport is a member of your organization. One of your recommendations is to this committee is that we increase the authorized levels of the Airport Improvement Program to $4 billion annually. Additionally, I understand that you are recommending improvements to this program. Can you elaborate on how your recommendations would be beneficial to airports like the ones in my district, and will this improve passenger experiences at the airport?
It will certainly improve passenger experiences at.
Are they some of your favorite airports? Let's start with
Some
there.
of your favorite, yeah, some of my favorite airports, but it will definitely improve the passenger experience at airports around the country. As I noted earlier, what we're looking for in the bump in AIP funding is to assist where inflation is eaten into the value we get out of these programs to support critical infrastructure projects at airports. So bumping the fee would help offset that. Putting flexibility into the AIP program to allow airports to use more landside with the AIP program would assist in developing terminals, developing landside facilities, and again, go to improving the passenger experience. The PFC program was another recommendation we made to move it up. And the PFC program at $450 today is a far cry less than all the ancillary fees that airlines charge their passengers. And if we're concerned with increasing the cost to customers, the ancillary fees do a lot more to increasing the cost to customers than a PFC fee does. The PFC program was stood up in 1990 as a way to promote competition and to afford airports the ability to have a funding source not controlled by the air carriers, to give them the ability to build infrastructure to allow for more competition to come in. That's the primary purpose of the PFC. It was bumped 10 years later to $450, and today we're sitting on a PFC fee that, due to inflation, gets you a lot less than it did back when it came into play. So I would give you that.
Thank you. Ms. Pinkerton, I know reading your priorities that we share similar goals of achieving a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Can you explain the importance of a sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, to achieving that goal?
I will, but first I just have to say.
No, this is my time.
All right. Sustainable aviation fuel, absolutely. You've seen our commitments. We're putting our money where our mouth is. We're investing in technologies. We're very appreciative that Congress passed the blender's tax credit. I think that's going to help us meet our mutual goals, because the federal government also has a goal of producing 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. So we're committed, and we hope that the committee continues on with the grant program that you've created for more production facilities.
Thank you. Ms. Pinkerton, just a follow-up question. What can we do to ensure airline and government reach these ambitious goals, particularly getting a 3 billion gallon of SAF?
Well, I think that SAF is the most important near-term thing that we can do. So again, I think the BTC was a good step in the right direction. We are going to need to extend that so that there's certainty for investors, and we're going to need to continue those grant programs into production facilities. We don't have very many going right now, and we've got a long way to go to meet our $3 billion goal. And so we appreciate the partnership with Congress.
Thank you, Ms. Pinkerton. I will let you and Mr. DiOlio fight out PFC charges versus ancillary fees by the airlines so that that could be at another forum. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carball. Mr. DeSaulnier, we will recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for being here. I think the most important thing for this system, we can all agree, is customer confidence in the system. And that goes to an area of interest I've been involved with since the near miss at San Francisco and the Air Canada, when we came 59 feet of having the largest air disaster in the history of this country. So with full acknowledgement that we've had a wonderful historical record, but these near misses and the NOTAMs are, to me, warning signs that we should be very, very alert to, not overreact, but the convergence, it seems to me, in my involvement in this, is between the financial model and your members. It's been a long time since Carl Icahn, but I was just reading about hedge funds going out of the aviation field more to the production of the products. But the financial pressure for your members, we're in a financial model where investors can go to a lot of places. So you have a lot of legitimate pressures, is what I'm saying. But then all of this thing and the partnership we've had between the FAA regulators and the private sector has worked for years. But there's different pressure now, particularly coming out of COVID. So starting, Mr. Santa, when I've talked to your members, with you, and particularly at SFO, having been in the tower there multiple times now, one of the challenges is, and similar for your staff, although you pay better on a national level, is where your members live. So what I hear from your employees and from your members is it's very expensive to live in New York or Boston or DC, so we're Chicago, Dallas, or San Francisco. So is the differential enough to attract and retain? And combined with the fact that we have to do a lot more training for your members because of technology and because of the pressure to make it work right and the whole issue of human factors. Could you
Yeah, some of
respond to
our
that?
facilities are very difficult to staff. We do have subsidies that that help support that.
But are they sufficient? Because the feedback I get is they're not.
In many cases, they're not for some of our very difficult to staff facilities, but that's why it's so important to find enough candidates that are from the location, and you hire locally, or you have to overstaff to get the homers and the people that want to stay there for life. We do have a very solid transfer program, so if you go and you certify in Oakland Center, there's an opportunity to leave after a period of time, but there are facilities that are understaffed precisely from what you say. They are very difficult to live there due to the cost of living.
So, Ms. Pinkerton, to the other question, a larger question about this partnership that we have that's been remarkable for years in this country between your members, the private sector, and we as government regulators, and all of the other divergent entities. This ability to invest in technology to make it more efficient, but particularly to invest in human factors and to let your investors know they're going to get a reasonable rate of return while we still maintain that confidence in the system. So Mr. Stuber and I have passed a bill just to create some pressure on FAA, maybe that's not the right word, to look at NOTAMs and continue to look at NOTAMs more successfully. We know page 8 of a 50-page document for the Air Canada pilots was a stupid thing to say, by the way, the runway's closed for construction, don't land on the taxiway, which they almost did, 3 full. So the money, so that bill, then we, in the Safe Landings Act, although I got a lot of that in the last reauthorization, we're going to be very active in getting more of it and continuous training. You've got turnover in your pilots and a lot of your employees. How do you feel, given the financial pressures you're under, how do you feel that we, overseeing FAA and you, stay on top of that So human factors, we're training new people, people who don't have the military aviation experience in the cockpit. How do we make sure we're on top of that along with the new technology? So three stools are the financial model, technology, and how we train people consistently and attract and retain them.
Well, as I said in my opening statement, we've identified people and training as our top priority. And I think carriers have done a good job. Obviously, a record amount of people, 100,000 people in 2 years. We're the biggest we've ever been. But we did that acknowledging that these folks were going to have less experience. So we put in special training programs, special proficiency requirements, because we absolutely acknowledge the human factors are critical. And safety is our top priority. We won't be in existence if we're not running a safe industry, and that's our top priority, period, full stop. And the technology, as I mentioned, the FAA has a lot of technologies as well. In particular, the surveillance technology on runways is something that they stopped implementing, and we've just got to get that back out there. And of course, you know, the staffing for controllers is, I completely support NACA's position here and want to see this shortage come to an end.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will recognize Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Way over here. Thank you for your testimony today. I like the phrase that aviation remains the most regulated, deregulated industry in America, and I think it's important to acknowledge the deregulation from the 1970s has resulted, obviously, in great advancements in the industry and drastically. And has seen drastic reduction in cost, which is useful. Obviously, when we talk about passenger experience, and I know this was touched on briefly, the one thing most people complain and know firsthand about are obviously length of delays, number of delays, and how that plays into the consumer experience. So, Ms. Pinkerton, you mentioned already and in testimony to the Senate Commerce Committee, and then I believe it's already come up to some degree, that there needs to be additional accountability by the DOT when it comes to operation issues on their end as it relates to delays. Could you just expand on that briefly?
Sure. I think specific to cancellations and delays is the staffing shortage issue. I mean, DOT yesterday issued an order, which we completely applaud and support, but they acknowledged that the reason they're having to limit flights in New York is because of staffing issues. So I think we need to be transparent about staffing shortages. We had issues in Jacksonville. We've got issues in Vegas. Rich can do a better job of telling you where all of the issues are, but we need the department to be transparent about that and transparent about what the fix is, this collaborative working program that's been put together by NATCA, MITRE, and the FAA.
Can we drill down just a little bit more on the question of transparency, not just the lack of staffing, but the truth is overall consumers, passengers would be better off knowing truly at every stage of a delay, of a problem with their own experience, knowing who's responsible for fixing, not necessarily who we're going to blame, but where in the system is this particular challenge. Can you just expand a little bit? And happy to let someone else jump in, although I do have one more question I want to get an answer to on the question of let's talk about enhancing that transparency.
Yes, I mean, the department does publish certain statistics about causes of delays and cancellations, but I'll be frank, it's
Please.
complicated, and we can all do a better job communicating about what the causes are and be more transparent about that.
Go ahead, sir.
It just, on the transparency issue, right now, the current model of reporting staffing, it's budget-driven, puts us at 103% staff. That's just, frankly, not accurate. We are much closer to 75 to 80% staff throughout our facilities. And to know that as an industry, and to know that as Congress, and to know that as a user, it's valuable. It's a valuable benchmark.
I appreciate that, and I think that is critically important. I mean, we have to be at least accurate with the information that we're providing. Can I also want to talk a little bit about, as it relates to workforce, and one of the solutions that was created in the last FAA reauthorization is the workforce development grants. Again, we know them as Section 625 grants. It is a priority for me. I spent a lot of time as a county official over the last 12 years focused on building that pipeline, using, in fact, these very dollars to build that pipeline for mechanics, pilots, in partnership with a local community college. Talk briefly about the benefit of the program and how sound that investment is, and I'd also dare say what the right level of funding is for an initiative of that nature.
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership. It was the first item that I mentioned in terms of our recommendations
Right.
for the FAA bill, so very appreciative. I'm sure you're aware, $10 million program had $120 million demand on it. So it's a wildly popular program. It's oversubscribed, and I think it's going to be critical to the success of our industry in meeting all of these goals, safety, efficiency, and whether or not we can provide service, the kind of service that we want to provide to a variety of communities.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to ask the question. I'm just going to say, as it relates to accessibility issues, there's a good platform that I hope we continue to focus on, the Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee and the Disabilities Bill of Rights. Talk about that offline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. I will now recognize Mr. Burchett. I'm sorry, Mr. Stanton. Jeez, Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes. I'm ahead of myself, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for all the witnesses for being here today. It's a very important hearing. As someone who flies twice a week to get to and from Washington from my home in Phoenix, I can say unequivocally, investments in our airports are key to improving the passenger experience from the moment they arrive at the airport until they reach their final destination. Last year, 44 million people flew through Sky Harbor Airport in Arizona. To meet current and future air travel demands, Sky Harbor has aggressively invested in new concourses and gates and more efficient taxiways. It has even added a people mover system called the SkyTrain to provide a seamless connection from the airport to ground transportation and the region's light rail system. These investments improve the experience for passengers, and they also create good-paying jobs. But these investments are not inexpensive, and it takes both local and federal resources to make them a reality. The Airport Improvement Program and the influx of federal resources provided under the bipartisan infrastructure law have helped jumpstart many important projects at our airports, including a new taxiway at Sky Harbor to improve efficiency. But let's be honest, we all know the needs still far outpace available resources. At Sky Harbor, revenue from the passenger facility charge has been an essential tool to help the airport modernize itself. However, the purchasing power of the PFC has eroded more than 40% since it was last adjusted more than 2 decades ago. Mr. Dolio, in your testimony, you note the current airport survey shows that over the next 5 years, our airports have $151 billion in infrastructure needs, but that current infrastructure dollars, even when factoring in the investments under the bipartisan infrastructure law, are woefully insufficient to meet those needs. Can you talk about what changes could be made to the PFC to help meet the growing infrastructure needs at our nation's airports?
Well, the PFC program, I spoke earlier to part of the beauty of PFCs is that the flexibility in using them. So you can do more with PFCs and say you could do with AIP dollars, which are more geared to airfield improvements. So it's the first thing. Second is, as you collect PFCs, you can use them in one of 2 ways. You can use them on a pay-go basis, as pay as you collect PFCs, or you can leverage PFCs through bond issuances and pay the debt service with PFCs, but get a lot more out of the PFC dollars that come in. So in airports, and airport leaders do that. We're maximizing what we can get out of the program. But the truth of the matter is its value has eroded, as you point out. What it would take is either moving the cap into the $758 range, and maybe index it for inflation so that it adjusts going forward, or eliminate the cap on PFCs. And it gives airports which is a very valuable tool, that tool that now is producing what it was intended to produce when the program was stood up. The increase would help mitigate the impacts of inflation over time. And if it's indexed to inflation, it would keep the fee current to current costs.
I appreciate that very much. Mr. Page, thank you for your steadfast advocacy to improve airline travel for those with disabilities. While progress has been made since the passage of the American Disabilities Act and the Air Carrier Access Act, we still have a long way to go to eliminate barriers and make air travel more equitable for those with disabilities. One of the PVA's priorities for the next FAA reauthorization bill is to reauthorize the Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee. In your opinion, what specific issues should the ACAA committee address if and hopefully when reauthorized?
Thank you for the question, sir. Well, one of the big issues I think that we've got left hanging out there, I'm not sure if the committee can address it or not, but is more physical access on an airplane for persons with disabilities and better seating accommodations that meet their needs. And then also better stowage in the belly of the airplane, and then have those wheelchairs and assistive devices returned in the manner that they're given to the airlines.
Thank you very much for that answer, and my time is up, so I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Next, I recognize Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Page, first I want to thank you for being here today. There are approximately 3.3 million wheelchair users in the United States, over half of whom are over the age of 65. Could you speak more in depth about ways airplanes could be designed to accommodate wheelchair users during the boarding process and in flight for access to bathrooms?
Thank you for the question. When it comes to getting on and off an airplane for a person with a disability, I think more training might be needed.
More what?
More training might be needed. Specifically, if you look at myself, I'm a person with permanent disability. I've been in a wheelchair over 40 years. I have spinal cord injury. A lot of the attendants, push attendants right now, are used to pushing a person to the edge and then that person getting up and walking in on their own, maybe. When it comes to persons with physical disabilities, more training in reference to getting on, and then because we have to be physically lifted into the seats.
Thank you, Mr. Page. You mentioned in your testimony that the PVA believes that passengers who utilize assistive devices should not be required to pay higher ticket prices for seats or alternative flights in order to accommodate their assistive devices. What would be a good mechanism to implement this option during payment for passengers with disabilities?
I think that's in reference to class of services. You know, the airline, back in the day when I first started flying, you had first class and then you had coach. And I think right now the question is, what seating area best accommodates that person, and sometimes, a lot of times when I book online my seat, I'll see that I'm in row 9, And then I go to the gate agent, and when I get there, mysteriously, I'm in row 32 now,
And you'd rather be in what row?
where I originally booked online at row 9 or 10 or closer to the front. Because the problem is, the further you go back, the more, especially on the aisle chair, there's more possibilities of becoming injured.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll recognize Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As always, you're dapperly dressed. If I had your wardrobe, I'd burn mine. So,
Thank you. You used up 3 seconds of your time saying that. I'll let you go over 3 seconds.
that's right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pinkerton, actually, I'm not here to knock you guys. I know some people think you're the devil, and maybe some people think you're not. I'm kind of in between on y'all. I get a little ticked off when my flights get delayed, and like everybody else does, and I have some little smart aleck in skinny jeans get up and try to tell me what's going on, and then I see what was really going on, and I get a little ticked off, but that could be addressed elsewhere. That's management more on the lower levels. But I feel like the airlines aren't delivering sometimes on their most basic promise, and that's to get our passengers and their luggage from one place to the other. What steps are you all taking to address delays and cancellations within your control? And specifically, I've seen this happen many times. You're about to take off, and then we got an issue. And the issue is, I believe that the pilots have flown too many hours, and yet they're allowed to be out. And it seems to me some kind of a regulatory situation, and we're kind of in the clients, which are the people flying, are kind of getting abused in this situation. And then they bring in other pilots, and then you're delayed again, and it just seems something else is afoot.
Yeah, I did experience myself that issue a couple weeks ago where the pilots timed out. But I would say our number one priority is getting you to your destination safely and efficiently and on time with your luggage. That particular rule was adopted in law by Congress to ensure that pilots were not working excessive hours. And so we comply with that. And I do realize that it does inconvenience passengers. I think it's for the safety of the system.
Okay. Yesterday, the Airlines for America published an opinion piece titled, "Policymakers Should Avoid Temptation of Subjecting Airlines to More Regulations." Has the FAA completed the rulemaking on provisions required by the 2018 FAA Reauthorization?
I think there are many provisions that required rules that have not yet been completed.
Okay. Have the airlines fully implemented requirements under the 2018 FAA Reauthorization?
For those rules that have been issued, yes.
Okay, just not for the ones, okay. Yeah, I guess if you didn't have the ones that weren't issued, it would be a case of mind reading on your all's part, maybe?
Right.
What existing regulations should be updated to improve the passenger experience?
What existing regulations do I believe improve?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, again, I think safety is really the FAA's mission, and safety and efficiency of the system, actually. That's codified, safety and efficiency of the system. And I think the passenger's experience, which, the most irritating thing is the delays and cancellations. That's what we get the most complaints about. And there are several technologies that we've talked about today that would make the system more efficient. The NOTAM, we're all familiar with that. Stopped the entire air traffic control system for an hour and a half. Hasn't happened since 9/11. So there's a long list of modernization programs that would make the journey more efficient.
We're seeing a lot of unruly passengers, and of course, everybody's YouTube looking for YouTube spots, I guess. And it happens that they attack these flight attendants and staffs, and really, frankly, I think they're dirtbags. Is there something in place where these folks will be banned for life from flying? Because they should be, because they risk the safety of everybody, and
Right.
And flying is not a right. You know, in Tennessee, they always say driving is not a right, it's a privilege. Well, flying definitely is a privilege.
Correct. And we worked very closely with TSA and the FAA during the pandemic and even today on a zero tolerance policy for that kind of behavior. And so the FAA brings charges against these unruly passengers. And in addition, carriers take their own measures in terms of banning them from flying that airline again.
On the other side of that, well, let's see. I'm out of time. I want to ask you more questions. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. I recognize Ms. Hoyle for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I live 3,000 miles away. There are no direct flights from Eugene, Oregon. So I spend a fair amount of time in airports, on planes, much like my predecessor, Mr. DeFazio. So this is thank you very much for showing up here. And I also am very grateful for all the workers in airports, on airlines, air traffic controllers that work in really high-stress jobs every day with limited resources and with customers that can be really cranky or aggressive. So thank you for your work. My question is for Rich Santa, National Air Traffic Controller Association President. You spoke earlier in your initial testimony about staffing challenges and how they contribute to airline inefficiencies. And when we ask the FAA about staffing, they say there's enough staffing and that the numbers show that everything is fine. But I think you alluded to this. One, we have staffing decisions being made by accountants as opposed to those who really know about safety and what we need. And also that trainees are counted in the same way that fully trained air traffic controllers are in terms of that head count. So what I would say is, given that the pipeline for new trainees was broken temporarily during COVID, and we have 1,200 fewer fully certified air traffic controllers today than there were 10 years ago, can you expand on what the issue is, how we need to solve it, and what I see is a giant red flag for safety considerations? What do you think we need to do about it?
Thank you so much for the question, and you really identified many of the issues. A budget-driven model reduces our controllers on a yearly basis because there are no other alternatives other than a safe operation. When you provide a safe operation, budget says, there you go, that's what you have. But when we talk about efficiencies, that's the contrast. You have to close sectors. You don't have redundancies. You don't have resiliency in the system. And certainly when we talk about some of the delays Ms. Pinkerton talked about, there's technologies out there that could help us with weather delays. We could use new weather on the radar scopes to funnel airplanes to where there's not impactful weather or severe weather. But that's the second tier of it. You need the people, you need the staffing, you need the sectors to be open, and you need to be able to handle the capacity that we're capable of handling safely. Always going to prioritize safety, always. But that comes as a result of inefficiencies. And we're talking about the passenger experience, making the connections. That's our part of it. Getting you there to your vacations on time. That's our part of it. We can't effectively do that when we're working too much airspace with not enough people, 6-day work weeks, 10-hour days.
Thank you. And follow-up question, could you talk more about why we're counting trainees who are not fully certified air traffic controllers in the head count of fully staffed people? Having to fly out of a smaller airport where we're always on the worst end of the staffing struggles, I'm perplexed and also very concerned about that sort of accounting sleight of hand.
It is an accounting sleight of hand. FAA finance, FAA budget, it looks better, right? Adding people who started yesterday, who 3 years from now might be capably comfortable working traffic by themselves are counted in the staffing numbers. It's not a transparent report. It's disingenuous to what we actually have. It doesn't allow the users, the airlines, the industry, Congress to accurately appropriate and accurately reflect what we have in our facilities.
I know that if there was a difficult situation, I would want someone that was fully trained and certified and didn't just start yesterday. No fault to that person handling a situation where so many lives are in danger. So thank you very much, and I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your very learned testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remained open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee now stands adjourned. Good helper.